In 1875, a wealthy Boston family committed an act so unspeakably cruel they sent their ugly daughter across America as a joke bride, expecting a frontier rancher to reject her on sight and send her crawling back in shame. But when Eleanor Blackthorne stepped off that train in Colorado, broken and humiliated, she had no idea this vicious prank would ignite a transformation so powerful it would destroy the family that betrayed her and build an empire they could never touch. This is the story of the woman who refused to stay unwanted. Stay until the end to see how the discarded daughter became the queen of the frontier, and please, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Eleanor's story travels across the world. The crystal chandelier threw fragments of cold light across the Blackthorne dining room as Eleanor pressed herself against the mahogany doorframe, her fingers digging into the wood hard enough to leave marks. Through the crack in the door, she watched her stepmother Margaret circle the polished table like a predator who'd just spotted wounded prey. A mail-order bride request. Margaret's voice dripped with amusement as she waved the letter in the air. For our darling Vivian from some cattle rancher in Colorado Territory, can you imagine? Eleanor's half-sister laughed, that musical sound that had charmed Boston society for years. A rancher? Mother, I'm engaged to Richard Pemberton. His family owns half the shipping industry in Massachusetts. Of course, darling. Margaret set the letter down, smoothing her silk skirts. But this Rhett Callahan fellow seems quite wealthy, owns thousands of acres, very respected in his territory, according to his representative. Eleanor shouldn't have been listening. She had long ago accepted her role in this house, the invisible daughter, the mistake from her father's first marriage, the plain shadow that made beautiful Vivian shine brighter by comparison. At 28, she had perfected the art of moving through rooms without being noticed, of sitting through family dinners without speaking, of existing without actually living. But something about Margaret's tone made her stomach twist. I have an idea, Margaret said slowly, and Eleanor recognized that particular inflection. It was the same voice her stepmother used before suggesting Eleanor should skip yet another social event to avoid embarrassing the family. A rather entertaining idea, actually. Vivian leaned forward, her perfect ringlets catching the light. Mother? What if we send Eleanor instead? The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She stopped breathing, her hand frozen on the doorframe. Vivian's eyes widened with delight. You can't be serious. Why not? The man asked for a Blackthorne bride. He didn't specify which one. Margaret's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Can you imagine his face when our Eleanor steps off that train? The rough frontier rancher expecting a Boston belle, and instead he gets, well, her. Eleanor looked down at her own reflection in the hallway mirror. Plain brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. A face too angular, too serious, with eyes that had learned early not to hope for kindness. A figure too tall, too thin, dressed in the simple gray wool dress that marked her as something between family and servant. He'd probably put her right back on the train, Vivian said, giggling. Oh, Mother, it's too cruel. Is it? We'd be giving Eleanor a chance at marriage. More of a chance than she'll ever get here. Margaret's voice took on that false sweetness that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Besides, it would teach that presumptuous rancher a lesson about making demands on respectable families, asking for our daughter as if she were a commodity to be ordered from a catalog. Eleanor's father, weak, distant William Blackthorne, cleared his throat from his chair by the fire. Margaret, perhaps this is taking things too far. Nonsense, William. Eleanor is 28 years old. She's never had a single suitor, never been invited to a proper dance. She sits in this house like a piece of furniture, eating our food, wearing clothes we provide. This could be her only opportunity for a life of her own. The rationalization was perfect. Margaret always was skilled at making cruelty sound like charity. And if he rejects her? William asked weakly. Then she comes home having had an adventure, and we'll have had quite an entertaining few weeks imagining that rancher's shock. Margaret paused. Unless you'd prefer she stay here forever, William, growing older and more desperate every year, is that what you want for your daughter? The silence that followed told Eleanor everything she needed to know. Her father wouldn't fight for her. He never had. I'll arrange it tomorrow, Margaret said with finality. We'll write to Mr. Callahan accepting his proposal on Vivian's behalf and send Eleanor in her place. By the time he realizes the substitution, it will be too late for him to refuse without causing a scandal. Eleanor finally moved, stepping away from the door on legs that felt like water. She made it to her small room at the back of the house, the room that had been a storage closet before her father remarried, and sat on the narrow bed staring at the wall. They were going to send her away as a joke, ship her across the country like a defective product, just to watch her fail one more time. She should have felt devastated, humiliated, broken. Instead, sitting in that tiny room with its bare walls and single window overlooking the alley, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a strange, fragile spark of possibility. Because going to Colorado, even as the punchline to a cruel joke, meant leaving this house, leaving the whispered comments about her appearance, leaving the social events where she sat in corners watching Vivian collect admirers like flowers, leaving the daily confirmation that she was unwanted, unlovely, and completely alone. If this rancher rejected her, she'd be no worse off than she was now. And if by some miracle he didn't, Eleanor stopped that thought before it could form. Hope was dangerous. Hope had been beaten out of her years ago by 1,000 small cuts, each one delivered with Margaret's perfect smile. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, Eleanor made a decision. If they were going to send her west as a joke, she would go. Not because she believed in fairy tales or happy endings, but because anything, even public humiliation in a frontier town, was better than dying slowly in this beautiful Boston prison. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood on the platform of the Transcontinental Railroad station, clutching a worn carpet bag that contained everything she owned. Margaret had provided a small trunk of Vivian's cast-off dresses, none of which fit properly, and a pouch with barely enough money for food during the journey. "Remember," Margaret said, adjusting her own elegant traveling hat with practiced precision, "when Mr. Callahan realizes the mistake, you're to accept his decision gracefully and take the next train home. No dramatics, no scenes. The Blackthorn name may not mean much in Colorado, but it still means something here." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The past 3 weeks had been a nightmare of preparation, Margaret coaching her on how to comport herself, Vivian laughing about the great frontier experiment, servants packing her bags with barely concealed pity. Her father hadn't come to see her off, too busy with business matters, according to Margaret. "And Eleanor," her stepmother added, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more vicious than shouting, "try not to embarrass us more than necessary. I know that's difficult for you, but do make an effort." The train whistle blew. Eleanor picked up her bag and walked toward the passenger car without looking back. She found a seat by the window and watched Boston disappear behind her in a haze of steam and smoke. For the first 3 days, she barely ate. The motion of the train made her nauseous, and every time she tried to sleep, she imagined the moment when Rhett Callahan would see her face and realize what kind of cruel trick had been played on him. By the 4th day, somewhere in the flat emptiness of Nebraska, Eleanor stopped caring. She watched the landscape change from familiar eastern forests to endless prairie. She spoke to no one. She read the same book over and over without retaining a single word. She existed in a strange state of suspension, neither moving forward nor falling back, just riding the rails toward whatever waited at the end. On the 8th day, a woman sat down across from her in the dining car. "First time west?" the woman asked. She was perhaps 40, with sun-weathered skin and capable hands that suggested a life of actual work rather than parlor entertainment. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "Family or adventure?" Eleanor almost laughed. "Marriage!" The woman's eyebrows rose. "Mail order?" There was no judgment in the question, just curiosity. Eleanor found herself nodding. "Well," the woman said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "that takes courage. I'm Sarah Drummond. My husband and I run a boarding house in Denver. Been out here 15 years now." "Is it very different from the East?" Sarah smiled. "Different doesn't begin to cover it, honey. Out here, nobody cares who your family was or what kind of china you eat off. They care if you can work, if you keep your word, and if you've got spine enough to handle hardship without folding." She paused. The frontier has a way of showing people who they really are. For some folks, that's terrifying. For others, well, it's freedom. Eleanor thought about that conversation for the remaining 3 days of the journey. She thought about it as the train climbed into the mountains, as the air grew thinner and colder, as the landscape became harsh and beautiful in ways that made Boston's manicured parks look like dollhouses. She thought about it as the conductor called out Red Hollow, Colorado territory, and the train began to slow. And she was still thinking about it as she stepped onto the wooden platform, her legs unsteady after so many days of travel, her carpet bag clutched in one hand and Vivian's too large trunk balanced precariously on the other. Red Hollow wasn't a town. It was barely a settlement, a collection of rough wooden buildings scattered along a single muddy street, surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The air smelled like pine and dust and something wild that Eleanor had no name for. The platform was nearly empty. A few rough-looking men loading supplies onto wagons. A woman in practical frontier clothing herding 3 children toward a general store. And standing near the station house, a tall figure in a dark coat and worn hat. Eleanor's heart stopped. Rhett Callahan. It had to be him. He stood with the kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence, scanning the platform as each passenger disembarked. When his gaze landed on Eleanor, it paused. She waited for the disgust, the anger, the immediate rejection. Instead, he walked toward her with long, measured strides. Up close, Rhett Callahan was nothing like the polished Boston gentleman who had ignored Eleanor her entire life. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and a face carved by wind and sun into hard angles. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of winter sky, and they studied Eleanor with an intensity that made her want to hide. But there was nowhere to hide. So she stood there, waiting for the blow. "Miss Blackthorne?" His voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting commands across open range. "Yes." Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm Eleanor Blackthorne." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. He glanced down at a letter in his hand, then back at her face. "The photograph they sent showed someone different," he said slowly. Here it comes, Eleanor thought. The moment Margaret had been waiting for. The punchline to her vicious joke. "That was my half-sister, Vivienne," Eleanor said, lifting her chin. "The family decided to send me instead." She waited for him to turn around and walk away. Waited for the laughter, or the cold dismissal, or the angry telegram back to Boston. Instead, Rhett Callahan did something completely unexpected. He took off his hat. "I see," he said, and his tone was impossible to read. "Well, Miss Blackthorne, I'm Rhett Callahan. Welcome to Red Hollow." Eleanor stared at him. "You're not... aren't you going to what?" "Send me back, on the next train." Rhett studied her for a long moment, those gray-blue eyes seeing things Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted revealed. Then he gestured toward a wagon parked near the station. "I made a commitment to marry a woman from the Blackthorne family," he said. "Far as I can tell, you qualify. Unless you want to go back?" It was the way he asked that question, not dismissive, not mocking, but genuinely giving her a choice, that made Eleanor's throat tighten. "No," she said. "I don't want to go back." "Then let's get your trunk. Ranch is about an hour's ride. We can talk on the way." He picked up Vivian's trunk as if it weighed nothing and carried it to the wagon. Eleanor followed, her mind spinning. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He was supposed to reject her. The joke was supposed to be on her. But as Rhett helped her into the wagon with surprising courtesy, Eleanor realized something that made her chest ache. Maybe the joke had been on Margaret all along. The ride to the Callahan Ranch took them through some of the most beautiful and brutal landscape Eleanor had ever seen. Mountains rose on either side of the narrow road, their peaks still covered in snow despite the late spring warmth. Pine forests gave way to open meadows filled with wildflowers, then back to rocky terrain that looked barely passable. Rhett didn't try to fill the silence with empty conversation. He drove the wagon with steady hands, occasionally pointing out landmarks. The creek that flooded every spring, the ridge where wolves sometimes gathered, the distant smoke from a neighboring ranch. Finally, Eleanor couldn't stand it anymore. "Why?" she asked. Rhett glanced at her. "Why what? Why didn't you send me back? You could have. The next train doesn't leave until tomorrow. You have time to change your mind." He was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Can I ask you something first?" "All right." "Did you know about the photograph? About the substitution?" Eleanor could have lied, could have pretended she was an innocent victim. Instead, she heard herself telling the truth. "I knew. I overheard them planning it. My stepmother thought it would be entertaining, sending you the wrong daughter. A joke at both our expenses. And you came anyway. I came because staying in Boston was worse than any humiliation you could possibly deliver." Rhett pulled the wagon to a stop. They were on a ridge overlooking a valley, and Eleanor could see buildings in the distance, a large ranch house, several barns, outbuildings scattered across what looked like thousands of acres. "See that land?" Rhett asked. Eleanor nodded. I built that ranch from nothing. Came out here 15 years ago with $300 and a horse. Fought drought, cattle thieves, harsh winters, and men who thought they could take what I'd built just because they were meaner or louder or more willing to cheat. He turned to look at her directly. I didn't build all that by judging people based on whether they looked pretty in a photograph. Then what do you judge them on? Whether they're willing to work, whether they keep their word, whether they've got the spine to handle hardship without folding. Eleanor recognized the words from Sarah Drummond's speech on the train. The frontier philosophy, the brutal honesty of a place where survival mattered more than appearances. I can work, she said quietly. I keep my word, and I've been handling hardship my entire life. Rhett studied her face for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself not to look away. Let him see the truth. Let him see the woman Margaret had tried so hard to hide. Then we'll get along fine, Rhett said finally. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon started moving again. Fair warning, though, ranch life isn't gentle. We've got 30 men working the property, cattle that need tending, horses that need training, and about 100 things that can kill you if you're not paying attention. I understand. Do you? He shot her a sideways glance. Because I need to know right now if you're the kind of woman who's going to faint at the sight of blood or burst into tears when things get difficult. Eleanor thought about all the years of Margaret's subtle cruelty. The social events where she'd been ignored or mocked, the daily confirmation that she was unwanted. The morning she'd found rat poison in the pantry and seriously considered using it just to end the constant ache of being invisible. Mr. Callahan, she said, I've survived things that would make cattle ranching look easy. I won't faint, I won't cry, and I won't embarrass you. Something that might have been respect flickered across his face. Call me Rhett. If we're getting married, might as well skip the formalities. The ranch house appeared as they crested a final hill. It was larger than Eleanor expected, a sprawling 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It looked solid, permanent. Nothing like the delicate Boston mansions that seemed designed more for display than actual living. Several men working near the barn stopped to stare as the wagon approached. Eleanor heard whispers, saw curious glances, felt the weight of being examined and judged. She kept her back straight and her expression neutral. Let them look. Rhett helped her down from the wagon, then gestured toward the house. Maria, she's the housekeeper. She'll show you to your room. We can talk more after you've had a chance to rest. I don't need rest, Eleanor said. I need to know what you expect of me. Rhett paused, one hand still on the wagon. What I expect? You said this isn't gentle work. I want to know what my role will be, what you need from me. For the first time since they'd met, Rhett smiled. It transformed his hard face into something almost warm. You really are nothing like that photograph, are you? No, Eleanor said. I'm really not. Good. He turned toward the house. Come on, let's introduce you to Maria and get you settled. Then we'll figure out exactly what kind of partnership we're building here. Partnership. Not marriage in the traditional sense. Not a romantic fairy tale. Partnership. Eleanor followed Rhett Callahan into the ranch house, and for the first time in her entire life, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. Maria Rodriguez was a compact woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been running a household for decades. She looked Eleanor up and down with frank assessment, then nodded as if confirming something. You're not what I expected, she said in accented English. I get that a lot, Eleanor replied. Maria's mouth twitched into something almost like a smile. Come, I'll show you the house. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, furnished with solid practical pieces rather than the ornate excess of Boston society. Everything looked used but well-maintained, lived in rather than displayed. Mr. Callahan built most of this himself, Maria said as they climbed the stairs. When he first came, he lived in a one-room cabin down by the creek. As the ranch grew, so did the house. Each room has a purpose. Nothing wasted. She led Eleanor to a bedroom at the end of the hall. It was larger than Eleanor's storage closet in Boston, with a real bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk near the window, and curtains that looked handmade but sturdy. This is yours, Maria said. Mr. Callahan's room is at the other end of the hall. He said to tell you that you'll have privacy until the wedding, and after, well, that's between you and him. Eleanor set down her carpetbag, looking around the room. Through the window, she could see the mountains in the distance, touched with gold from the setting sun. How many women has he brought out here? She asked quietly. Before me? None. Maria leaned against the doorframe. He's had offers. Plenty of them. Women in town, daughters of other ranchers. But Mr. Callahan, he doesn't do anything halfway. When he finally decided it was time to marry, he wanted someone who understood business. Someone educated. Someone who could handle the complications of running a property this size. She paused. He thought a Boston woman would have that kind of polish and education. Instead, he got me. Instead, he got you, Maria agreed. And speaking as someone who's worked for him for 10 years, I think he might have gotten exactly what he needed instead of what he thought he wanted. Before Eleanor could respond, there was a commotion outside, shouting, the thunder of hooves, men calling orders in urgent tones. Maria's expression shifted immediately. Stay here, she said, already moving toward the stairs. But Eleanor didn't stay. She followed Maria down and out onto the porch, where chaos had erupted in the ranch yard. A group of men had just ridden in hard, their horses lathered and blowing. In the center of the group, a young man was draped across his saddle, his shirt soaked with blood, his face gray with pain. Trampled in the south pasture, one of the riders was saying as Rhett strode toward them, cattle spooked by something. Tommy got caught in the stampede before we could pull him clear. How bad? Rhett's voice was controlled but tight. Bad, boss. Real bad. We need Doc Mitchell, but he's down in Clear Creek for the week. Won't be back for 3 days at minimum. Eleanor watched as they carefully pulled the injured man down from the horse. He couldn't have been more than 19, and consciousness was clearly slipping away from him. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages on his chest and leg. The men looked at each other with the helpless panic of people who knew how to handle cattle and weather, but had no idea how to save a dying boy. Someone ride for Doc Mitchell anyway, Rhett ordered. Even if it takes 3 days, we need him here. Boss, 3 days? I know! Rhett's jaw was tight. Just ride. Eleanor moved before she could think about it. She crossed the porch and walked directly into the circle of frightened men. Bring him inside, she said. Maria, I need hot water, clean cloths, and the sharpest knife you have. Also whiskey, the strongest you've got. Everyone stared at her. Now, Eleanor snapped, using a tone she'd perfected from years of listening to Margaret give orders to servants. Unless you want to watch him die in your yard. Miss Blackthorne, Rhett started. I've studied medicine, Eleanor interrupted, meeting his eyes directly. Not formally because women aren't allowed in medical schools, but I spent 5 years apprenticing with our family physician back in Boston without my stepmother knowing. I can't guarantee I can save him, but I can guarantee he'll die if we stand here debating. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Rhett nodded sharply. Do what she says. All of you. The men jumped into action. They carried the injured ranch hand, Tommy, into the house and laid him on the dining table. Maria appeared with everything Eleanor had requested, her movements quick and efficient. Eleanor pushed up her sleeves and examined the damage. It was worse than she'd hoped. 3 ribs definitely broken, one possibly puncturing the lung based on the way he was breathing. A deep gash across his chest that was still bleeding. His left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Another fracture, this one compound with bone visible through torn flesh. I need everyone out except Maria and Mr. Callahan, Eleanor said, and someone should hold him down. This is going to hurt. The next 2 hours were a blur of blood, whiskey, and desperate concentration. Eleanor set the broken leg first, using torn bed sheets as bandages and 2 pieces of wood from the kindling pile as splints. Tommy screamed once when the bone shifted back into place, then passed out completely. Better. Easier to work on an unconscious patient. She cleaned and stitched the chest wound with thread from Maria's sewing kit, her hands steady despite the blood. Then came the ribs, the dangerous part. She bound them carefully, trying to stabilize the chest wall without restricting breathing too much. Throughout it all, Rhett stayed nearby, his presence solid and calm. He didn't flinch at the blood, or the smell, or Tommy's occasional moans. He just handed Eleanor whatever she needed and kept out of her way. Finally, as the sun was setting outside, Eleanor stepped back from the table. Tommy was still breathing. Not well, but steadily. The bleeding had stopped. The bones were set. He had a chance. Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were covered in blood. Her gray dress, the one she'd worn on the train, was ruined beyond repair. She was shaking with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. Will he live? Rhett asked quietly. I don't know, Eleanor admitted. If infection sets in, probably not. If the broken rib damaged his lung more than I think, maybe not. But he has a chance now. Without treatment, he had none. Rhett was looking at her with an expression Eleanor couldn't interpret. Where did you learn to do that? Dr. Harrison, our family physician. I started helping him when I was 17. Margaret thought I was visiting the poor with charitable donations. Eleanor laughed, but it came out bitter. Turns out being invisible has advantages. Nobody pays attention to where you go or what you learn. You should clean up, Maria said gently. I'll watch him tonight. No. Eleanor pulled up a chair next to the table. I'll watch him. If he takes a turn, I need to be here. Miss Blackthorne, you've been traveling for over a week. You're exhausted. I'll watch him, Eleanor repeated more firmly. Rhett and Maria exchanged a glance. Then Rhett nodded. I'll bring you coffee and something to eat. He left. Maria stayed for a moment, studying Eleanor's face. You're stronger than you look, she said finally. I've had a lot of practice at being underestimated. Maria smiled, a real smile this time. Good. You'll need that here. Tomas. Tommy woke up 3 times during the night. Each time, Eleanor was there with water and quiet reassurances. By dawn, his color had improved slightly, and his breathing was easier. Rhett appeared in the doorway as the first light touched the windows. He looked like he'd slept in his clothes, probably because he had. How is he? Alive, Eleanor said. Fever hasn't set in yet. That's the biggest danger now. Rhett walked over to the table studying Tommy's sleeping face. You saved his life. Maybe. Ask me again in 3 days. No. Rhett turned to look at her directly. You saved his life. Those men, they're good at what they do, but they would have just watched him die. You didn't hesitate. You knew exactly what needed to be done. And you did it. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. Back in Boston, her medical knowledge had been a secret shame. Another way she was odd, unwomanly, inappropriate. Margaret would have been horrified to know her stepdaughter had spent years elbow-deep in blood and disease. But here, it had mattered. It had saved someone. The men are going to talk, Rhett continued. Word spreads fast out here. By tonight, everyone in Red Hollow will know what you did. Does that bother you? Bother me? Rhett actually laughed. Eleanor, I've been trying to convince a doctor to settle in Red Hollow for 5 years. The nearest real medical help is a full day's ride away. People die out here from things that would be simple to treat with proper care. He paused. What bothers me is that you've been here less than 24 hours, and you've already proven more valuable to this community than I dared hope. Something in Eleanor's chest loosened. Not quite hope. She was still too wary for that, but something close. I should wash up, she said, suddenly aware of how she must look. Blood-stained, exhausted, her hair falling out of its bun in wild tangles. Maria left clean clothes in your room, and there's a bathing room at the end of the hall, one of the few luxuries I allowed myself when building this place. Rhett hesitated, then added, Thank you. For Tommy. For not hesitating. I did what anyone with medical training would have done. No, Rhett said quietly. You did what someone brave enough to act does. There's a difference. He left before Eleanor could respond. She sat with Tommy for another hour, until Maria appeared to take over the watch. Then she climbed the stairs to her room, stripped off the ruined dress, and stepped into the bathing room. Hot water. Actual hot water, piped in from somewhere. Another unexpected luxury in this frontier ranch. Eleanor sank into the bath and let the warmth soak into her aching muscles. She watched the water turn pink with Tommy's blood and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she'd stepped off a train expecting rejection and humiliation. Instead, she'd found a man who judged her by her actions rather than her appearance. A community that needed exactly the skills she'd hidden for years. A place where being useful mattered more than being pretty. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It wasn't any of the fairy tale endings that Vivian probably expected from her society marriage to Richard Pemberton. But lying in that bath, washing away blood and exhaustion, Eleanor realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she felt necessary. And that might be worth more than all the love stories in the world. Tommy survived. 3 days later, when Doc Mitchell finally arrived from Clear Creek, he examined Eleanor's work and pronounced it better than most surgeons in Philadelphia could manage. Word did spread, just as Rhett predicted. Within a week, Eleanor had treated 2 more patients, a woman in difficult childbirth and a child with a badly infected wound. The frontier people came to her warily at first, suspicious of the Boston bride who claimed medical knowledge. But Eleanor had learned long ago not to care about suspicion. She just did the work. She also learned the ranch. Rhett was patient but thorough, showing her the account books, the livestock management, The delicate balance of water rights and grazing rotation that kept the ranch profitable. Eleanor absorbed it all with the same focus she'd brought to medical texts. At night, she sat in the ranch house office and reorganized the financial records into a system that actually made sense. Rhett had been managing everything in his head and in scattered ledgers, a method that worked but wasn't sustainable as the ranch grew. "You have a talent for this," he said one evening, watching her work. "I had a lot of time in Boston," Eleanor replied, not looking up from the columns of numbers. "When you're not invited to balls or social events, you find other ways to occupy yourself." Their loss. Eleanor did look up then. Rhett was leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Why did you really agree to this?" she asked. "Marriage to a stranger from Boston. You could have found someone here, someone who already understood frontier life." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he walked into the office and sat down across from her. "Because everyone here knows me," he said finally. "Knows my history, knows what I've built. If I married a local woman, there would always be questions about whether she wanted me or wanted the ranch, whether I was choosing her or just choosing convenience." He paused. "I wanted to start fresh, with someone who saw the man rather than the empire. And instead you got me, who sees neither. You see the work," Rhett corrected. "You see what needs to be done and you do it. That's more honest than romance." Eleanor thought about that, about the practical partnership they were building, about how strange it was to have conversations like this with a man she barely knew but was planning to marry. "When?" she asked. "When what?" "When should we get married? You haven't mentioned a date." Rhett studied her face. "Are you in a hurry?" "No, I just want to know what to expect." "Fair enough." He stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the ranch yard. "End of summer. Give you time to settle in properly. Make sure this is really what you want before we make it permanent. And if I decide it's not, then I'll give you money for the train ticket, and you can go wherever you want. No strings." Eleanor stared at him. "You just let me leave." "Eleanor, I'm not in the business of keeping people prisoner. If you want to go, you go. But—" He turned back to face her. "I hope you'll stay." The words were simple, honest, nothing like the flowery declarations Vivian's suitors had made, all poetry and passion with no substance underneath. But somehow, they meant more. "I'll stay," Eleanor said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is the first place that's ever felt like it might actually need me." Rhett smiled, that rare transforming expression that made him look years younger. "Then we'll make it official end of summer. Give the ranch hands something to celebrate after the hard season." He left her to her bookkeeping. Eleanor returned to the neat columns of numbers, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about Margaret's cruel joke, about the family that had shipped her west expecting humiliation and failure. She thought about writing them a letter, telling them what her life had become. Then she decided against it. Let them wonder. Let them imagine the worst. The truth, that Eleanor had found purpose and respect in a place they'd chosen specifically to destroy her, would be a far better revenge than any letter could deliver. But that revenge would have to wait. Because 3 weeks after Eleanor arrived in Red Hollow, everything changed. A letter arrived from Boston. And this time, it wasn't a joke. It was a declaration of war. The envelope was expensive paper, cream-colored with the Blackthorne family crest embossed in gold. Eleanor recognized it immediately when Maria handed it to her in the ranch kitchen, where she'd been showing 2 of the ranch hands' wives how to properly clean and dress wounds. "Came with the mail wagon this morning," Maria said, her eyes sharp. "From Boston." Eleanor's hands stilled on the bandage she'd been demonstrating with. The 2 women, Sarah Chen and Martha Williams, exchanged curious glances but had the grace not to ask questions. "Thank you," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level. "We can continue this tomorrow." "Same time?" They nodded and left, whispering to each other the moment they cleared the porch. Eleanor waited until their voices faded before breaking the wax seal. The letter was written in Margaret's perfect script, each word placed with surgical precision. "Dearest Eleanor, we have recently become aware of certain rumors regarding your situation in Colorado Territory. While we are gratified to hear you have not been immediately rejected as we anticipated, we must express our grave concerns about the propriety of your continued presence there. It has come to our attention that Mr. Callahan may not be the respectable businessman he purported to be in his initial correspondence. Our sources suggest his fortune was built through questionable means, and his standing in territorial society is far from secure. Furthermore, your father and I are deeply troubled by reports that you have been engaging in activities wholly unsuitable for a woman of your station, specifically practicing medicine without proper credentials or legal authority. Such behavior reflects poorly on the Blackthorn name and could expose our family to legal complications. We therefore insist that you return to Boston immediately before you cause irreparable damage to our reputation. We have enclosed funds for your passage and will expect you on the eastbound train within the fortnight. Your sister Vivian sends her regards. Her wedding to Richard Pemberton is scheduled for October and will be the social event of the season. We trust you will have the sense to absent yourself from such festivities, given the circumstances. With familial concern, Margaret Blackthorn. Eleanor read it twice, her jaw tightening with each pass. The funds mentioned were nowhere in the envelope. Another small cruelty, forcing her to humiliate herself by asking for money if she actually wanted to leave. But it was the casual mention of sources and reports that made her stomach turn cold. Margaret had hired someone to investigate her, to watch her, to gather information that could be weaponized. Bad news? Eleanor looked up to find Rhett standing in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. He was in his work clothes, dirt on his boots, his shirt rolled up to his elbows. "My stepmother wants me to come home," Eleanor said, handing him the letter. "She's heard I'm not being properly humiliated out here and considers it a personal affront." Rhett read the letter in silence, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set it on the table with careful control. "She hired investigators," he said. "That's what sources means. Someone's been asking questions about me, about the ranch. I heard rumors last week, but didn't think much of it." "What kind of questions?" "How I made my money, whether I have enemies, whether the ranch is mortgaged. The kind of questions people ask when they're looking for ammunition." He looked at Eleanor directly. "This isn't just about you. She's planning something." Eleanor felt a familiar helplessness creeping in, that old sensation of being a chess piece moved by forces she couldn't control. Then she remembered Tommy, alive and walking again because she'd acted instead of waiting for permission. She remembered the ranch accounts, organized and accurate for the first time in years. She remembered 3 weeks of being useful instead of invisible. "What can she actually do?" Eleanor asked. "I'm 28 years old. Legally, she can't force me to return." "Legally, no." Rhett sat down across from her. "But she can make things difficult. If she spreads the right rumors back east, it could affect my business relationships. I ship cattle to markets in St. Louis and Chicago. Those buyers care about reputation. If word gets out that I'm some kind of frontier criminal who tricks naive Boston women, but that's absurd. None of it's true. Truth doesn't matter much when you're dealing with gossip and social pressure." Rhett ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "The railroad expansion is coming through this territory in the next 2 years. I've been negotiating contracts to supply beef for the work crews. Those contracts could make this ranch one of the most profitable in Colorado. But the men I'm dealing with, they're Eastern businessmen. They care about propriety and social standing." Eleanor understood immediately. "If my stepmother convinces them you're disreputable, they'll withdraw their offers." "Exactly. So she's not just trying to punish me, she's trying to destroy you to get to me." Rhett smiled grimly. "Seems like your stepmother doesn't appreciate being made to look foolish. Her cruel joke didn't work out the way she planned, so now she's escalating." Eleanor stared at the letter on the table, Margaret's perfect handwriting mocking her from the expensive paper. All her life she'd survived by being small, by accepting cruelty without fighting back, by disappearing when conflict arose. But something had changed in the 3 weeks since she'd stepped off that train. Maybe it was saving Tommy's life. Maybe it was the respect she saw in the eyes of people who came to her for medical help. Maybe it was the way Rhett talked to her like an equal partner instead of a decorative burden. Or maybe it was simply that she'd finally found something worth fighting for. "No," Eleanor said quietly. Rhett raised an eyebrow. "No. I'm not going back. And we're not going to let her destroy what you've built just to satisfy her vindictiveness." Eleanor stood up, pacing to the window. "She expects me to run. That's what I've always done. Disappear when things get uncomfortable. Let her win without resistance." "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor turned to face him. "We fight back. But not the way she expects. Margaret operates in a world of social manipulation and whispered scandals. She's probably never encountered real resistance in her life. Just people who either submit or engage on her terms. And you want to change the terms." "I want to expose her," Eleanor said, the plan forming as she spoke. "She sent me here as a joke. She orchestrated a cruel scheme to humiliate both of us. That's the truth. And truth is a weapon if you know how to use it. Rhett studied her with that intense focus she was learning to recognize. What exactly did you have in mind? Letters? To newspapers, to territorial officials, to business associates back east. We tell the story exactly as it happened. How the Blackthorn family sent their daughter west as a prank, expecting her to be rejected and humiliated. How I came anyway, knowing it was a setup, because staying in Boston was worse than any frontier rejection could be. That would require you to expose yourself, to admit publicly that your own family treated you that way. I'm already exposed, Eleanor said. She's made sure of that with her investigators and rumors. The difference is, right now, she controls the narrative. She decides what people hear and how they interpret it. But if I tell the story first, if I own the truth instead of hiding from it, she loses that power. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to his office, returning with paper and a pen. He set them on the kitchen table. Write it, he said. Tell the story exactly as it happened. I know people at the territorial newspapers, and I have business contacts in St. Louis who deal with the eastern markets. We'll make sure the right people hear the truth before your stepmother's poison can spread. Eleanor sat down at the table, the blank paper in front of her. For 3 weeks, she'd been building a new life, carefully avoiding thoughts of the family that had sent her away. Now she was going to drag all of it into the light. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. Then she thought of Margaret's smug certainty that Eleanor would never fight back. The absolute confidence that the unwanted daughter would accept whatever cruelty was dealt to her. Eleanor's hand steadied. She began to write. The words came easier than she expected. She wrote about being the invisible daughter in a house full of beauty and social ambition, about overhearing the plan to send her west as a joke, about making the choice to go anyway, knowing it was a trap, because anything was better than the slow death of being unwanted. She wrote about Rhett's unexpected decency, about finding purpose in a place that needed her skills instead of hiding them, about a community that judged her by her actions rather than her appearance. She didn't soften the cruelty or dramatize the triumph. She just wrote the truth in clear, simple language that anyone could understand. When she finished, 3 hours had passed. Eleanor's hand was cramped and her eyes were burning, but she had 5 pages of careful script that laid out the entire story. Rhett read it without comment, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked at Eleanor with something that might have been admiration. "This will cause a scandal," he said. "Good, let it. Your family will be furious." They were already furious that their joke failed. At least this way, everyone will know why. Rhett folded the letter carefully. "I'll have copies made tomorrow. Send them to every newspaper between here and Boston, to my business associates, to territorial officials who might need to know the character of the people they're dealing with. And then? Then we wait and see if your stepmother is as powerful as she thinks she is when she's fighting on unfair ground." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety she'd been carrying for 3 weeks without realizing it. She was fighting back, actually fighting back instead of accepting abuse as her natural state. It was terrifying. It was also exhilarating. The next morning, Rhett rode into Red Hollow with Eleanor's letter. He returned that afternoon with copies being prepared by the town's small printing press and confirmations from the telegraph office that messages were being sent to contacts in Denver, St. Louis, and Chicago. "Give it 2 weeks," Rhett said. "Maybe 3. Then we'll see what happens." Eleanor tried to focus on her normal routine. She treated patients, a worker with a badly sprained wrist, a woman with troubling chest pains, a child with a persistent fever. She reorganized more of the ranch accounts, discovering several errors in past tax calculations that could have caused problems during territorial audits. She learned to ride properly, spending early mornings with one of the ranch hands who had infinite patience for teaching a Boston woman how to handle a horse. But underneath the routine, anxiety gnawed at her. What if the plan backfired? What if people believed Margaret's version instead of the truth? What if Eleanor had just made everything worse? 10 days after Rhett mailed the letters, the first response arrived. It was from a newspaper editor in Denver, a man named Samuel Pierce, who Rhett knew from business dealings. He'd printed Eleanor's story in full, along with an editorial condemning the barbaric practice of treating daughters as disposable commodities in cruel social games. "It's starting," Rhett said, showing Eleanor the newspaper. "Pierce has connections throughout the territory. If he picked up the story, others will follow." 3 days later, a letter arrived from St. Louis. One of Rhett's business associates, a cattle buyer named James Morrison, wrote that Eleanor's story was circulating rapidly among respectable business circles, and that he'd already heard several prominent families expressing disgust at the Blackthorne family's behavior. Then came a letter from Chicago, then another from Denver, then one from a women's rights advocate in San Francisco who wanted permission to reprint Eleanor's account in a pamphlet about the treatment of unmarried women by their families. Within 2 weeks, Eleanor's story had spread across the Western Territories and was making its way back east through business correspondence and newspaper exchanges. And then Margaret's counterattack arrived. It came in the form of a letter from a Boston attorney named Horace Whitfield, written on expensive letterhead and delivered via express courier. Mr. Rhett Callahan, I represent the Blackthorne family in a matter of grave legal concern. It has come to my client's attention that you are currently harboring their daughter, Eleanor Blackthorne, at your ranch in Colorado Territory. Furthermore, you have engaged in a systematic campaign of defamation against my clients, publishing falsehoods and malicious statements designed to damage their reputation and social standing. My clients contend that Miss Eleanor Blackthorne was never authorized to marry you or any other person, and that any such union would be legally void. They further contend that Miss Blackthorne's mental faculties have been compromised by the trauma of frontier living, rendering her unable to make sound judgments about her own welfare. Therefore, we demand the following. 1. The immediate return of Miss Eleanor Blackthorne to Boston, where she can receive proper medical and psychiatric care. 2. A full retraction of all defamatory statements published about the Blackthorne family. 3. Financial compensation for damages to my client's reputation in the amount of $50,000. Failure to comply with these demands within 30 days will result in legal proceedings that will, I assure you, be both lengthy and damaging to your business interests. Respectfully, Horace Whitfield, Esquire. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each reading making her angrier. She's claiming I'm mentally incompetent, that I can't make my own decisions. It's a standard tactic, Rhett said grimly. If she can convince people you're not in your right mind, everything you wrote gets dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed woman. And the demand for money? Intimidation. $50,000 is more than most frontier ranches earn in 5 years. She's trying to scare me into compliance by threatening to bankrupt me with legal fees. Eleanor set the letter down, her hands shaking with fury rather than fear. What do we do? We could fight it in court, get territorial judges involved, but that takes time and money, and there's no guarantee we'd win. Eastern attorneys have ways of complicating things that can drag on for years. So she wins? After everything? I didn't say that. Rhett walked to the window, thinking. Your stepmother is operating on the assumption that we're isolated out here, that we don't have resources or connections that can match hers. But she's wrong. How? Because while she was building social connections in Boston, I was building business relationships across half the continent. I know territorial governors, railroad executives, cattle barons, mining magnates, not as social equals, but as partners who respect results more than pedigree. Eleanor felt hope stirring. You think they'd help? I think they'd be interested in knowing that Eastern society families are trying to interfere with territorial business through legal intimidation. The West has a complicated relationship with Eastern power. People out here don't appreciate being bullied by Boston attorneys. Over the next week, Rhett activated every connection he had. He wrote to territorial officials, explaining the situation and providing copies of both Eleanor's account and the attorney's threatening letter. He contacted business partners who had their own grievances with Eastern legal manipulation. He even reached out to the governor's office, pointing out that allowing Boston families to dictate terms to Colorado citizens set a dangerous precedent for territorial autonomy. The response was faster and stronger than Eleanor had dared hope. The territorial governor's office sent an official letter to Horace Whitfield, informing him that Eleanor Blackthorne was a legal adult residing voluntarily in Colorado Territory, and that any attempt to remove her against her will would be considered kidnapping under territorial law. 3 different newspaper editors published editorials condemning the Eastern legal overreach and defending Eleanor's right to live where she chose. A prominent Denver attorney offered to represent Eleanor pro bono if the Blackthorne family pursued legal action, stating that he was tired of watching Eastern families treat the territories like their personal fiefdoms. And perhaps most surprisingly, a group of frontier women, ranchers' wives, business owners, teachers, sent a collective letter to newspapers across the West, supporting Eleanor's decision to escape an abusive family situation and praising her contributions to Red Hollow's community. Eleanor watched it all unfold with a mixture of astonishment and fierce satisfaction. She'd spent her entire life being powerless, accepting cruelty because she had no resources to fight back. Now she had resources. She had allies. She had proof that standing up to bullies could actually work. But Margaret wasn't finished. 4 weeks after the attorney's letter arrived, a different kind of attack emerged. It started with subtle rumors circulating in Red Hollow itself. Whispers that Eleanor wasn't really a doctor, that she was practicing medicine illegally and putting people at risk, that the Blackthorn family's concerns about her mental state might be legitimate. Sarah Chen came to Eleanor one afternoon, her expression troubled. "I heard something in town today," Sarah said, "from a woman I didn't recognize. She was asking questions about you, about whether you'd made any mistakes treating patients, whether anyone had gotten worse under your care." Eleanor felt cold. "Margaret hired someone local to spread doubt." "That's what I thought. Martha heard similar questions at the general store. Someone's trying to turn the community against you." The strategy was clever, Eleanor had to admit. Margaret couldn't force her to return through legal means, so now she was attacking Eleanor's standing in Red Hollow itself. If the community lost faith in her medical abilities, she'd lose the purpose and respect that had made staying worthwhile. Eleanor found Rhett in the ranch office, going over supply orders. "She's changed tactics," Eleanor said, explaining what Sarah had reported. "Instead of attacking you or trying to drag me back legally, she's trying to poison my reputation here." Rhett's jaw tightened. "That won't work. People here have seen what you can do. They know you saved Tommy's life. They know you've treated dozens of injuries and illnesses successfully. But doubt is insidious. It doesn't require proof, just suggestion. If people start questioning whether I know what I'm doing, they'll stop coming to me for help. And without that," Eleanor's voice cracked slightly, "that's the only thing that makes me valuable here." Rhett stood up and walked around the desk. He took Eleanor's shoulders firmly but gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. You're not valuable because you can treat injuries. You're valuable because you're smart, capable, and brave enough to stand up for yourself. The medical knowledge is a skill, but the person using that skill, that's what matters." "You don't understand." "I do understand. Your stepmother convinced you that your only worth comes from being useful to others. But that's a lie, Eleanor. You have worth because you exist, because you're you. Everything else is just bonus." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd spent 28 years believing her worth depended entirely on what she could provide to others. That being useful was the only way to justify taking up space in the world. But Rhett was looking at her like she mattered beyond her utility, like she was valuable just by existing. Eleanor didn't know what to do with that. "We still need to address the rumors," she said, deflecting. Rhett let it go, stepping back. "Agreed. But we address them head on, not by defending yourself. Defense makes you look guilty even when you're not. Then what? We go on the offensive, publicly, show everyone exactly what you're capable of." 2 days later, Eleanor held the first public medical demonstration Red Hollow had ever witnessed. Rhett organized it, spreading word throughout the territory that a trained medical practitioner from Boston would be giving a presentation on basic wound care and emergency treatment. Eleanor expected maybe a dozen people. Instead, over 50 showed up. Ranch families, townspeople, workers from neighboring properties. They gathered in the Red Hollow Community Hall, curious and skeptical in equal measure. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Public speaking had never been her strength. She'd spent her life trying to be invisible, not the center of attention. But she thought of Margaret, smug and certain that Eleanor would crumble under pressure. She thought of Tommy, alive because she'd acted instead of hiding. She began. "I'm not a licensed physician," Eleanor said clearly. "Women aren't allowed to attend medical schools or obtain official credentials. But I spent 5 years apprenticing with Dr. William Harrison of Boston, learning everything he could teach me about anatomy, treatment, and emergency care." She paused, meeting eyes throughout the crowd. "Some of you have heard rumors questioning my abilities. Those rumors were started by people who want me to fail. Not because I'm incompetent, but because my success is inconvenient for them. So today, I'm going to show you exactly what I know, and you can decide for yourselves whether to trust me." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor demonstrated proper wound cleaning, bone setting, fever management, and emergency childbirth assistance. She explained the reasoning behind each technique, answered questions with detailed medical knowledge, and even allowed skeptical observers to examine the medical texts she'd brought from Boston. By the end, the skepticism had transformed into something else. Respect. Understanding. And for some, particularly the women who'd had terrifying experiences with difficult childbirths and no medical help, profound relief that someone with real knowledge was available. "My wife nearly died last year," one rancher said, his voice rough with emotion. "Baby was breech. If we'd had someone who knew what to do—" He stopped, unable to continue. "I know what to do," Eleanor said quietly, "and I'm here. That's all I can offer." The demonstration became a turning point. Instead of undermining Eleanor's position, Margaret's rumor campaign actually strengthened it by forcing Eleanor to prove her capabilities publicly. People who'd been uncertain before now had concrete evidence of her knowledge. The mysterious woman asking questions disappeared from town. Either Margaret recalled her agent or decided the strategy had backfired too badly to continue, but Eleanor knew her stepmother wasn't done. Margaret Blackthorne didn't accept defeat gracefully. The real attack came 6 weeks after Eleanor had first written her letter. It arrived in the form of a society column from a Boston newspaper, forwarded by one of Rhett's business contacts with a note. "Thought you should see this." The column was written by someone named Constance Hartwell, one of Boston's most influential social arbiters. It focused on Vivian's upcoming wedding to Richard Pemberton, describing it as the social event of the season, with guest lists that included governors, senators, and business magnates. But buried in the flowery descriptions was a paragraph that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The Pemberton-Blackthorne union is particularly poignant given the family's recent trials. Sources close to the Blackthornes confirm that elder daughter Eleanor suffered a complete mental collapse and fled to the frontier territories in a state of delusion. The family's brave attempts to retrieve their troubled daughter have been thwarted by an unscrupulous rancher who apparently sees opportunity in Eleanor's compromised state. The Blackthornes ask for privacy during this difficult time as they pursue legal remedies to protect their vulnerable daughter. Eleanor read it twice, then handed it to Rhett without speaking. He scanned it quickly, his expression darkening. "This is worse than the attorney's letter." "Why?" "Because it's not a legal threat. It's a social assassination. She's reframing the entire narrative. Instead of you escaping an abusive situation, you're now a mentally ill woman being exploited by a greedy frontier criminal." Rhett set the newspaper down. "And she's doing it right before Vivian's wedding, when she'll have maximum social influence and sympathy. So everyone who reads this will think I'm insane and you're taking advantage of me." That's the goal. Eleanor felt the familiar helplessness creeping back, that old sensation of being crushed by forces she couldn't fight. Then she looked around the ranch office, at the organized ledgers she'd created, at the medical texts stacked neatly on the shelf, at the window overlooking land where people trusted her enough to bring their children when they were sick. She thought about the past 2 months, about everything she'd built and proven. "No," Eleanor said. Rhett looked at her. "No? I'm not letting her rewrite reality. Not this time." "What are you thinking?" Eleanor stood up, pacing as the plan formed. "She's using Vivian's wedding as a platform. Maximum visibility, maximum sympathy. Everyone who matters in Boston society will be there, reading these columns, forming opinions based on Margaret's version of events. So? So we give them a different story, one they can't ignore. Eleanor, we've already published your account. The story is out there, but it's competing with Margaret's version. People back east don't know which one to believe. They're reading about poor, deluded Eleanor in the same newspapers that printed my letter. The narratives are canceling each other out. What would make them believe you instead of her?" Eleanor stopped pacing, the answer crystallizing. "Proof. Undeniable, public proof that I'm not mentally incompetent or being exploited. Proof that I've built something real here." "What kind of proof?" Eleanor met his eyes. "We get married. Not in 3 months like we planned. Now, publicly, with witnesses from across the territory. We invite newspaper reporters. We document everything. And we make sure the story reaches Boston before Vivian's wedding." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. "That's a big step to take just to win a publicity battle." "Is it? We were already planning to marry. We've been building a partnership for 2 months. The only thing changing is the timeline. Eleanor, marriage is permanent. You'd be tying yourself to me legally, publicly, permanently. Not because you want to, but because your stepmother forced your hand. That's not—" He stopped, frustrated. "You deserve better than that." "Better than what? A marriage of convenience that's actually based on mutual respect and shared purpose? That's more than most society marriages have." Eleanor sat down across from him. "Rhett, I'm not asking for romance or pretending this is a love match. I'm asking if you're willing to make our partnership official now instead of later, and to do it publicly enough that my stepmother can't keep spreading lies about my mental state. And if you change your mind later, if you wake up one day and realize you made this decision because you were angry rather than because you actually wanted to marry me. The question was fair. Eleanor thought about it seriously, looking at the man across from her. Rhett Callahan had shown her more respect in 2 months than her family had provided in 28 years. He'd given her space to work, valued her contributions, defended her against attacks, and never once made her feel like a burden or a disappointment. Was that love? Probably not. But it was something solid, something real. I won't change my mind, Eleanor said, because this decision isn't about anger. It's about choosing the life I want instead of accepting the life others choose for me. And I want this, the ranch, the work, the partnership we're building. I want it enough to make it permanent. Rhett studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right, we'll do it, but we do it properly, not some rushed courthouse ceremony. If we're making a public statement, it needs to be big enough that Boston can't ignore it. How big? The biggest celebration Red Hollow has ever seen. They set the date for 3 weeks out, just enough time to organize properly, but still beating Vivian's October wedding by a month. Rhett sent invitations to every rancher, business owner, and community leader within 100 miles. He contacted newspaper editors in Denver, St. Louis, and Chicago, inviting them to cover the wedding of the frontier's most talked-about couple. Eleanor worked with Maria and the ranch hands' wives to organize food, decorations, and accommodations for guests traveling from far distances. She also wrote a personal letter to Constance Hartwell, the Boston Society columnist who'd published Margaret's lies. Dear Miss Hartwell, I read with interest your recent column regarding my family's trials. I write to correct several factual errors in your reporting. I did not suffer a mental collapse. I made a conscious, deliberate choice to leave Boston after my stepmother orchestrated a plan to send me west as a cruel joke. I am not being exploited by an unscrupulous rancher. I am building a genuine partnership with a man who treats me as an equal. And I am not vulnerable or incompetent. I am the primary medical practitioner for a frontier community that previously had no access to professional care. I will be marrying Mr. Rhett Callahan on September 15th in Red Hollow, Colorado territory. You are welcome to attend and report accurately on the event, should you wish to correct your previous errors. Sincerely, Eleanor Blackthorne. She didn't expect Constance Hartwell to actually attend, but the letter, which Eleanor ensured was copied to other society columnists, served its purpose. It put her version of events directly in front of the people who'd been reading Margaret's lies. As the wedding date approached, Eleanor watched responses arrive, acceptances from neighboring ranchers, confirmations from newspaper editors, even a letter from the territorial governor's office stating that a representative would attend to observe this important moment in Colorado's development. But nothing from Boston. No response from Constance Hartwell. No angry telegram from Margaret. Just silence. It made Eleanor more nervous than any threat would have. She's planning something, Eleanor told Rhett 3 days before the wedding. Margaret doesn't give up this easily. Let her plan, Rhett said. We're doing this regardless. Whatever she tries, we handle it together. Together. Eleanor turned the word over in her mind, testing its weight. She'd spent her entire life alone, even when surrounded by family. The idea of actually having someone on her side felt foreign and fragile, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the real revenge against Margaret wasn't just escaping or exposing her cruelty. Maybe it was building something good enough that Margaret's poison couldn't touch it. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and cold, with autumn already touching the mountain peaks with early snow. Eleanor woke before sunrise, her stomach tight with nerves that had nothing to do with Margaret's potential interference. She was getting married today. Actually, married. Making permanent what had started as a temporary escape. Maria came to help her dress, bringing a gown that Eleanor had never seen before. Where did this come from? Eleanor asked, touching the simple ivory fabric. Mr. Callahan had it made, Maria said. Ordered it from Denver the day you agreed to move up the wedding. He said you deserved something that actually fit properly. The dress was beautiful in its simplicity. No excessive lace or uncomfortable corsetry, just clean lines and quality fabric that actually flattered Eleanor's tall frame instead of fighting it. Eleanor blinked back unexpected tears as Maria helped her into it. You're nervous, Maria observed. Terrified, Eleanor admitted. Of Mr. Callahan? Of hoping this is real. Every time I've hoped for something good, it's been used against me. Maria was quiet for a moment, fixing Eleanor's hair. Then she said, "Hope is dangerous, but so is never hoping at all. At least if you hope and fail, you tried for something. If you never hope, you just survive. And surviving isn't living." Eleanor thought about that as she descended the stairs to find Rhett waiting. He'd traded his usual work clothes for a formal suit that looked uncomfortable on his rancher's frame, but his eyes when he saw her held something Eleanor couldn't quite interpret. "You look—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "You look exactly right. Not beautiful, not pretty, just right." Somehow that meant more than any flowery compliment could have. The wedding took place on a ridge overlooking the ranch, with the entire valley spread below and mountains rising on all sides. Over 200 people had gathered, far more than Eleanor expected. Ranch families, town residents, business associates from Denver and beyond. And yes, 3 newspaper reporters, notebooks ready. Let them write. Let Boston read. Let Margaret choke on the truth. The ceremony itself was brief. No elaborate religious pageantry, just a territorial judge reading the legal vows and asking for their agreement. Eleanor spoke her part clearly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. When Rhett said, "I do," she almost believed this might actually work. The celebration that followed lasted into the night. Food, music, laughter that echoed across the valley. People toasted the couple with genuine affection rather than obligation. Ranch hands danced with their wives. Children ran wild between the tables. Eleanor found herself standing apart at one point, just watching it all unfold. This was her life now. These people were her community. This land was her home. It felt impossible. It felt fragile. It felt real. Second thoughts? Rhett appeared beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "No, just trying to believe this is actually happening." "It's happening." He handed her the coffee. "We're married, publicly, legally, with about 50 witnesses and 3 newspaper reporters who've been writing down every detail. Do you think it'll be enough to stop Margaret?" "I think we'll find out soon enough." He was right. The answer came 4 days later, in the form of a newspaper from Boston that arrived with the regular mail delivery. Constance Hartwell had printed a retraction. Not a full apology, that would have been too much to expect, but a correction stating that further information has come to light regarding Eleanor Blackthorne's situation in Colorado Territory, and that her recent marriage to prominent rancher Rhett Callahan suggested she was in full possession of her faculties and acting of her own volition. The retraction was small, buried on page 3, but it existed. Margaret's narrative had cracks, but Eleanor knew her stepmother well enough to recognize that cracks didn't mean defeat. They just meant Margaret would have to try harder. And she was right. The final attack came 3 weeks after the wedding, on the day of Vivian's ceremony to Richard Pemberton. It arrived in the form of a telegram, delivered during dinner. Eleanor opened it with Rhett looking over her shoulder. "Vivian wedding canceled. Stop. Pemberton family withdrew. Stop. Business failures and social disgrace. Stop. Blackthorne, reputation destroyed. Stop. This is your fault. Stop, return immediately, or face permanent severance. Stop. Margaret." Eleanor read it 3 times, her hands shaking. Her fault. Margaret was blaming her for the collapse of Vivian's perfect wedding. "It's not your fault," Rhett said quietly. "You telling the truth didn't destroy their reputation. Their own actions did that." "But Vivian," Eleanor's voice caught, "she didn't do anything wrong. She's losing everything because I fought back." "No, she's losing everything because your stepmother made a choice to escalate instead of backing down. That's on Margaret, not you." Eleanor wanted to believe that, but guilt gnawed at her anyway. Vivian might have participated in Margaret's cruelty, but she was also trapped in the same system that had crushed Eleanor for years, and now she was paying the price for her mother's vindictiveness. "Do you want to go back?" Rhett asked. "Try to fix things?" Did she? Eleanor thought about Boston, about the life she'd left behind, about her father's weak acquiescence and Vivian's careless participation in Margaret's schemes. She thought about the telegram's threat: return or face permanent severance, as if being cut off from that family would be a punishment rather than a relief. "No," Eleanor said, setting the telegram aside. "I'm not going back. Margaret thinks she can threaten me with abandonment, but she already abandoned me years ago. This is just making it official." She waited for guilt to overwhelm her, for doubt to creep in, for that old voice that said she was selfish and cruel for choosing herself over her family. Instead, she felt something else entirely: peace. The peace lasted exactly 4 days. Then winter arrived early, dropping 18 inches of snow in a single night and trapping half the territory in conditions that made travel impossible. Eleanor woke to find the ranch buried in white, the mountains invisible behind curtains of falling snow, and Rhett already gone to check on the livestock. She dressed quickly, layering wool and flannel against the cold that seemed to seep through the walls. Downstairs, Maria was stoking the kitchen fire, her expression tight with worry. 3 families are stranded on the North Ridge, Maria said without preamble. Riders came through before dawn. They tried to reach town when the storm hit, but had to turn back. They're holed up in the old line cabin with no supplies. Eleanor's medical instincts kicked in immediately. How many people? 11 total. 4 adults, 7 children. One of the women is heavily pregnant, due any day now. How far is the cabin? 3 miles, but the snow is still coming down. Rhett says it's too dangerous to attempt a rescue until the weather breaks. Eleanor walked to the window, staring at the white chaos outside. 3 miles might as well be 30 in these conditions. But a woman about to give birth, trapped in an unheated cabin with no medical supplies and 7 frightened children, the decision made itself. Where's Rhett? Eleanor asked. Barn, checking the horses. Eleanor grabbed her coat and pushed out into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Snow already knee-deep made each step a struggle. She found Rhett in the stable, checking hooves and distributing extra feed. Maria told me about the stranded families, Eleanor said. Rhett didn't look up from the horse he was examining. Storm should break by tomorrow afternoon. We'll reach them then. Tomorrow might be too late. That woman could go into labor any time. I know. His voice was tight. But trying to reach them in this weather would be suicide. We'd get lost, freeze to death, or both. Then nobody gets help. What if we don't wait for the storm to break? What if we go now, while it's still light enough to see landmarks? Rhett straightened, turning to face her fully. Eleanor, you've never traveled in frontier winter conditions. 3 miles in normal weather is different from 3 miles in a blizzard. The temperature is dropping fast. Visibility is maybe 20 feet. One wrong turn, and we're wandering blind until we freeze. So we don't make wrong turns. You know this land better than anyone. You could navigate it in your sleep. Knowing the land doesn't help when you can't see it. Rhett's frustration was edged with something deeper, fear maybe, or the weight of impossible choices. I'm not risking your life on a rescue mission that has maybe a 30% chance of success. It's not your decision, Eleanor said quietly. I'm going, with or without you. Rhett stared at her like she'd lost her mind. You'll die out there alone. Then come with me and improve my chances. This isn't about proving something to your stepmother. Margaret is back in Boston. She can't see. This has nothing to do with Margaret. Eleanor's voice was harder than she intended. This is about a woman who might die giving birth in a freezing cabin because we decided it was too risky to help. I didn't survive 28 years of cruelty just to become the kind of person who lets others suffer when I could act. The words hung between them, stark and unarguable. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he exhaled hard and turned back to the horses. We take the 2 strongest mounts, pack light, medical supplies, blankets, emergency food. We follow the north fence line as far as it goes, then strike east toward the ridge. If visibility drops below 10 feet, we turn back immediately. No arguments. Agreed. And Eleanor? He looked at her directly. If I say we can't make it, you listen, because if we die out there, those families die too. Understood? Understood. 30 minutes later, they rode out into the storm. The world disappeared within minutes. Everything became white. The ground, the air, the sky all bleeding together into a disorienting void. Eleanor clung to her horse, following Rhett's dark shape ahead of her, trusting him to know where the fence line ran even when she couldn't see it. The cold was brutal. It found every gap in her clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Her face went numb first, then her hands despite thick gloves, breathing hurt, each inhale like swallowing knives. They'd been riding maybe an hour when Rhett pulled up short, raising a hand. Eleanor urged her horse alongside his. What's wrong? Fence line ends here. Rest of the way is open country. Rhett's voice was muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. This is where it gets dangerous. If we lose our bearings, we could wander for hours without hitting any landmarks. Can you navigate by the slope? The ridge should be uphill from here, in theory. But snow can hide changes in elevation, makes everything look flat. He was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he pointed to a barely visible cluster of trees to their left. See those pines? They're leaning east, away from the prevailing wind. If we keep them on our left and angle uphill, we should hit the cabin. Should? It's the best I can offer. Eleanor nodded. Then let's go. They pushed forward into unmarked territory. Eleanor lost all sense of time and distance. Everything became reduced to the immediate. Stay on the horse, keep Rhett in sight, keep breathing despite the cold, keep moving. At some point, her horse stumbled. Eleanor gripped the saddle horn as the animal recovered, then realized what had caused the misstep. They were climbing now, the ground rising in a steady grade that meant they were approaching the ridge. There! Rhett's shout barely carried over the wind. Eleanor squinted through the snow and saw it, a dark shape that resolved into a small log structure as they drew closer. The line cabin. Smoke rose from a crude chimney, which meant the families had managed to get a fire going despite the conditions. Relief hit so hard Eleanor felt dizzy. They dismounted and pounded on the cabin door. It opened immediately, revealing a man in his 40s with desperate eyes and a face gray with exhaustion. Thank heaven, he breathed. We didn't think anyone could reach us in this. Probably shouldn't have been able to, Rhett said, pushing inside. How's everyone holding up? The cabin was cramped and cold despite the small fire. 2 families huddled together, the Hendersons and the Carters, Eleanor learned quickly. 7 children ranging from toddler to teenage, shivering under shared blankets. And in the corner, a woman lying on a makeshift bed of coats, her face contorted with pain. Eleanor went to her immediately. I'm Eleanor Callahan, she said, kneeling beside the woman. I have medical training. Can you tell me your name? Sarah Henderson. Her voice was thin with pain. The baby, it's coming. Contractions started about 2 hours ago. Eleanor did a quick examination, her hands working with practiced efficiency despite the cold. How far apart are the contractions? Maybe 5 minutes? I'm not sure. Everything hurts. 5 minutes. Early labor still, which meant they had time, but not much, especially in these conditions. Has your water broken? Not yet. That's good. Means we have a little while before active labor hits. Eleanor looked at Sarah's husband, the man who'd opened the door. I need you to keep that fire going as hot as you can manage. We need this space warm before the baby arrives. And I need clean water. Melt snow if you have to, but it needs to be boiled. He nodded and moved to follow orders, grateful to have something concrete to do. Eleanor turned to Rhett, who was assessing the cabin's supplies. We can't move her, not until after the birth. I know. Which means we're stuck here until the storm breaks and it's safe to transport everyone. Could be days. Could be. Rhett pulled out the supplies they'd brought, extra blankets, dried food, medical equipment Eleanor had insisted on packing. Good thing you're stubborn about preparation. Over the next hour, Eleanor transformed the cramped cabin into something resembling a functional medical space. She organized her supplies, instructed the older children on how to help, and kept Sarah calm with steady conversation about nothing in particular, the kind of meaningless talk that helped distract from pain. Sarah's contractions intensified as evening approached. 5 minutes apart became 4, then 3. Her water broke just as the storm outside reached its peak fury, wind howling against the cabin walls hard enough to make the structure shudder. I need to push, Sarah gasped. Not yet. Eleanor checked her progress again. Almost there, but not quite. I need you to breathe through the next few contractions. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, her face slick with sweat despite the cold. The children had been herded to the far side of the cabin, the older ones keeping the younger ones distracted with quiet games and stories. The other adults hovered uselessly, wanting to help but having no idea how. Except Rhett. He'd positioned himself near Eleanor, ready to hand her whatever she needed before she had to ask. His presence was steady and calm, which helped more than he probably realized. All right, Eleanor said after another examination. Next contraction, you can push. What followed was intense and messy and terrifying in the way childbirth always was, a process that was simultaneously natural and dangerous, routine and potentially fatal. Sarah screamed through the contractions. Eleanor coached her through each push, monitoring the baby's position, watching for complications. The cabin had gone completely silent except for Sarah's labored breathing and Eleanor's calm instructions. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting. And then, a baby's cry. Sharp and indignant and absolutely perfect. Eleanor caught the infant, clearing its airway and wrapping it quickly in clean cloth. It's a girl, a healthy girl. Sarah was crying and laughing at the same time, reaching for her daughter with shaking hands. Eleanor delivered the afterbirth, checked for excessive bleeding, and made sure both mother and baby were stable before finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion waiting to crash over her. She sat back on her heels, her hands covered in blood, her whole body trembling with spent adrenaline. Rhett appeared beside her with a cup of water. "You did good." "We got lucky. No complications." "Luck had nothing to do with it. You knew what you were doing." Eleanor drank the water, letting the simple act ground her. Around the cabin, the tension had broken into relieved celebration. The children were allowed to see their new sister. The other family members were passing around food and hot coffee, the mood shifting from terror to joy. "How long until we can move them?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Storm's supposed to break by morning. We can start transporting people back to the ranch once visibility improves. Might take a few trips, but we'll get everyone out safe." "And if the storm doesn't break?" "Then we wait. We have enough supplies for 3 days if we're careful. More if we stretch it." Eleanor nodded, too tired to worry about possibilities. She cleaned up, washing blood from her hands with melted snow water, then found a corner where she could sit with her back against the wall. Rhett sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You know what's going to happen when word gets out about this," he said. "What?" "Every pregnant woman within 50 miles is going to want you present for their delivery. You just became the most valuable person in the territory." Eleanor laughed, but it came out exhausted. "I'm not valuable. I just did what needed doing." "That's exactly what makes you valuable." Rhett was quiet for a moment, then added, "Your stepmother was an idiot to send you away. She didn't know I had medical training. To her, I was just the ugly daughter who made Vivian look better by comparison." "Then she's blind as well as stupid." Eleanor looked at him, this man she'd known for 3 months and married 6 weeks ago. His face was weathered from years of frontier living, his hands scarred from ranch work, his entire presence the opposite of the refined Boston gentleman who'd ignored her for years. And he was looking at her like she mattered, not because she was useful, but because he saw who she actually was. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, "for coming out here, for not making me choose between helping those families and staying safe. You would have gone without me. I would have, but I'm glad I didn't have to." Rhett's expression softened into something Eleanor couldn't quite read. Then he stood up, offering her a hand. "Come on. You need rest. I'll take first watch to keep the fire going." Eleanor let him pull her up, then found a spot near the fire where she could stretch out under a borrowed blanket. Despite the discomfort and the cold and the storm still raging outside, sleep came quickly. She woke to pale morning light filtering through gaps in the cabin walls. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in snow, but finally, mercifully still. Rhett was already organizing the evacuation. Who could ride? Who needed to be carried on makeshift sleds? What route would be safest for transporting a woman who'd given birth hours earlier? It took 3 trips to get everyone back to the ranch. Eleanor rode with Sarah and the baby on the first journey, keeping close watch for any signs of complications. But mother and daughter both remained stable, and by afternoon, all 11 stranded people were safely installed in the ranch house. Maria moved through the chaos with calm efficiency, organizing food and bedding and coordinating with neighboring ranches to find temporary housing for the displaced families. The ranch house became a temporary refugee camp, children running through hallways, adults comparing storm stories. The baby, named Hope, at Eleanor's quiet suggestion, being passed around and admired. Eleanor treated minor frostbite, checked on Sarah's recovery, and answered what felt like 100 questions about pregnancy and childbirth from women who'd never had access to actual medical advice. By evening, she was so exhausted she could barely stand. She escaped to her bedroom and collapsed on the bed, still wearing most of her clothes. She woke hours later to find Rhett sitting in the chair by the window, watching her with that unreadable expression she was starting to recognize. "What time is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Past midnight. You slept through dinner." "I should check on Sarah." "Maria checked on her an hour ago. She's fine. Baby's fine. Everyone's fine because you risked your life to reach them." Rhett stood up, walking to the bed. "Do you have any idea how terrified I was out there? Watching you ride through that storm, knowing one wrong step could kill us both?" Eleanor sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "You didn't have to come." "Yes, I did. Because you were going regardless, and I couldn't let you face that alone." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most reckless. I haven't decided which." "Can I be both? That's what worries me." But his tone had softened. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. When I asked you to marry me, when I agreed to move up the wedding to counter your stepmother's attacks, I thought I was getting a practical partnership, someone intelligent and capable who could help run the ranch, a business arrangement with mutual respect. Eleanor's chest tightened. And now I'm realizing I got a lot more than I bargained for. Someone who'll ride into a blizzard to save strangers, who'll stand up to legal threats and social assassination, who'll fight for what's right even when it's easier to walk away. He sat down on the edge of the bed. That's not a business partner. That's someone worth... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Worth what? Eleanor prompted quietly. Worth everything, Rhett finished. And that's dangerous, because I didn't plan on actually caring this much. It wasn't supposed to be part of the arrangement. Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. Rhett Callahan, practical, controlled Rhett who approached everything like a business transaction, was admitting that their marriage had become something more than convenience. I don't know what to do with that, Eleanor admitted. Neither do I. Rhett stood up, putting distance between them again. But I needed you to know. Before things get more complicated. More complicated than they already are? Your stepmother isn't done with us. You know that, right? The canceled wedding, the social disgrace. That's going to make her more desperate, not less. She'll come at us harder. Let her. Eleanor was surprised by how much she meant it. I'm not afraid of Margaret anymore. She sent me here to destroy me, and instead I found a life worth defending. Whatever she does next, we'll handle it. We, Rhett repeated. You keep saying that. Because it's true. We're partners. Isn't that what you wanted? I wanted a lot of things. Not all of them turned out the way I expected. He moved toward the door, then paused. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll need to help resettle those families, and the whole territory is going to want to hear the story of the doctor who delivered a baby in a blizzard. He left before Eleanor could respond. She lay back down, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Rhett had feelings for her, real feelings, beyond respect and partnership. And Eleanor had no idea what to do with that information, because the truth was, she had feelings for him too. Somewhere between the practical partnership and the shared battles against Margaret's attacks, something had shifted. She looked forward to their evening conversations about ranch business. She felt safer when he was nearby. She respected his judgment and valued his opinion in ways that went beyond mere convenience. But love? Eleanor didn't even know what that looked like. She'd spent her whole life being told she was unlovable. The idea that someone like Rhett, strong, capable, respected, could actually care about her felt impossible and terrifying, and maybe, possibly, worth exploring. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. 2 riders approached the ranch carrying official-looking documents and wearing the kind of formal clothing that marked them as outsiders to frontier life. Eleanor watched from the porch as Rhett went to meet them, their conversation too distant to hear but clearly serious based on body language. After several minutes, Rhett returned to the house with the documents in hand and his expression carefully neutral. What is it? Eleanor asked. Legal papers, from a firm in Denver. He handed her the documents. Your stepmother filed suit against me for fraud, coercion, and unlawful imprisonment. She's claiming I manipulated you into marriage while you were mentally incompetent, and she wants the marriage annulled. Eleanor read through the dense legal language, her stomach sinking. Margaret had escalated from social attacks to actual legal action. This wasn't just rumors and newspaper columns anymore. This was a formal attempt to dissolve Eleanor's marriage and drag her back to Boston. Can she do this? Eleanor asked. She can file the suit. Whether she can win is another question. Rhett paced to the window, his jaw tight. But even if we win, the process could take months, maybe years. It'll tie up time and money, and the publicity alone could damage the ranch's reputation enough to kill those railroad contracts. So she's trying to destroy you financially while claiming to protect me. How noble of her. The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from now in Denver. We'll need lawyers, witnesses, evidence that you're acting of your own free will and in full possession of your faculties. He turned back to face her. Eleanor, this is going to get ugly. They'll question your judgment, your sanity, your character. They'll drag every detail of your life into public record. Are you prepared for that? Eleanor thought about it. Really thought about it. Margaret was offering her an escape, a legal annulment that would end this marriage and return her to Boston, where she'd be properly controlled and managed. A year ago, even 3 months ago, she might have been tempted by the familiarity of that old life, no matter how painful. But now she had patients who trusted her, a community that respected her, work that mattered, and a partnership with a man who saw her as valuable beyond her utility. "I'm prepared," Eleanor said. "Let her drag it all into public. Let her question my sanity. I'd rather be called crazy for choosing this life than sane for accepting the one she wanted me to live." Rhett smiled, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his face. "Then we fight. Again." "Again," Eleanor agreed. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing. Rhett hired a Denver attorney named Marcus Webb, who specialized in territorial law and had a reputation for embarrassing Eastern lawyers who thought frontier courts would be easy victories. Eleanor compiled evidence of her medical work, testimonials from patients, documentation of successful treatments, letters from community members attesting to her competence and sound judgment. Sarah Henderson and her husband wrote a particularly powerful statement about how Eleanor had saved both mother and baby during the blizzard, risking her own life to provide medical care. Tommy, the ranch hand whose life Eleanor had saved on her first day in Red Hollow, traveled to Denver specifically to testify. "If Mrs. Callahan was crazy," Tommy told the attorney during preparation, "then I'd want every doctor in America to be exactly that kind of crazy. She knew what she was doing, still does." The day before the hearing, Eleanor received an unexpected letter. The return address was Boston, but the handwriting wasn't Margaret's. Eleanor opened it carefully. "Eleanor, I don't know if you'll even read this. I wouldn't blame you if you burned it without looking. Mother told me not to write to you. She said you've chosen your path and we should let you suffer the consequences. But I can't stop thinking about what you wrote in your letter, the one that got published in all those newspapers, about overhearing us plan to send you west as a joke, about knowing it was a trap and going anyway because staying here was worse. I participated in that plan. I laughed about it. I thought it was funny that Mother was teaching you a lesson about knowing your place. And I never once considered how cruel that was, or how it must have felt to be you, listening to your own family plot your humiliation. My wedding to Richard is canceled. His family withdrew when our reputation collapsed. Mother blames you for that. Says if you'd just come home quietly instead of making a public spectacle, none of this would have happened. But I've had time to think, and I realized something. You didn't destroy our reputation. You just told the truth about who we actually are. And apparently, when people see the truth, they don't like us very much. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For every time I laughed at your expense. For every time I made you feel invisible or worthless. For participating in cruelty and calling it humor. Mother is determined to win this lawsuit and bring you back to Boston. She spent a fortune hiring lawyers and investigators. She genuinely believes she's saving you from yourself. But I've read the letters people sent to newspapers about you, about the medical work you're doing, the lives you've saved, the respect you've earned. And I think, maybe for the first time in your life, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I hope you win. I hope you get to keep the life you've built. And I hope someday I can find the courage you showed when you got on that train. Your sister, Vivian." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her emotions a complicated tangle. Anger at years of casual cruelty. Suspicion that this was another manipulation, but also, unexpectedly, a faint thread of something that might have been forgiveness. Vivian was trapped in the same system that had nearly destroyed Eleanor. The difference was that Eleanor had escaped, while Vivian remained caught in Margaret's web of social ambition and performative perfection. "Good news?" Rhett asked, finding her on the porch. "I'm not sure." Eleanor handed him the letter. "My sister apologizing, or trying to." Rhett read it, his expression thoughtful. "Do you believe her?" "Part of me does. Part of me thinks it's another scheme." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "But either way, it doesn't change what we're doing tomorrow. Margaret is still trying to destroy everything I've built, and I'm still going to fight her. No matter what the cost. No matter what the cost." The Denver courthouse was smaller than Eleanor expected, a 2-story brick building that served multiple territorial functions. Inside, the courtroom was packed with spectators. News of the hearing had spread, and apparently half of Denver wanted to watch the Eastern Society lady try to reclaim her wayward daughter. Margaret was already seated when Eleanor and Rhett entered. She looked exactly as Eleanor remembered, perfectly dressed in expensive black silk, her posture rigid with controlled fury, her expression carefully arranged in maternal concern. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Eleanor refused to look away first. The judge was a weathered man in his 60s named Harrison Wade, who had a reputation for being unimpressed by Eastern legal posturing. He called the court to order and listened to opening statements from both sides. Margaret's attorney, a polished Boston lawyer named Theodore Ashworth, painted a picture of an innocent, mentally fragile woman manipulated by a ruthless frontier opportunist. He described Eleanor's history of instability and desperate need for family guidance, claiming that Rhett had taken advantage of her vulnerable state to secure an unpaid servant disguised as a wife. Marcus Webb, their attorney, countered with documented evidence of Eleanor's medical competence, testimonials from community members, and the simple fact that Eleanor was a legal adult capable of making her own decisions. Then came the witnesses. Margaret took the stand first, playing the role of concerned mother with practiced skill. She described Eleanor's troubled childhood and social difficulties, twisting every instance of Eleanor's isolation into evidence of mental incompetence. "My daughter was always withdrawn," Margaret said, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. She had difficulty forming normal relationships. She spent excessive amounts of time reading medical texts, an obsessive behavior that suggested deeper psychological issues. When Mr. Callahan's proposal arrived, I feared Eleanor would accept out of desperation rather than genuine feeling, and I was right. "You sent her anyway," Webb pointed out during cross-examination. "I hoped the frontier might be good for her. Fresh air, simple living. I never imagined Mr. Callahan would take advantage of her condition." Her condition being what exactly? The court has seen no evidence of mental illness or incompetence. She practices medicine without credentials. She married a stranger after knowing him for weeks. She refuses all family contact. These are not the actions of a sound mind. Webb smiled. Or they're the actions of an independent woman making choices her family doesn't approve of. Which isn't the same thing as insanity, Mrs. Blackthorne. The cross-examination continued, Webb systematically dismantling Margaret's characterization of Eleanor as mentally unfit. By the time Margaret stepped down, her maternal concern had frayed into obvious anger. Then Eleanor took the stand. Ashworth approached her with predatory confidence. "Miss Blackthorne, Mrs. Callahan," Eleanor corrected. "The validity of that marriage is precisely what we're here to determine," Ashworth said smoothly. "Now, Mrs. Blackthorne claims you have a history of mental instability. Is that accurate?" "No." "You've never experienced episodes of depression or anxiety?" Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I experienced years of emotional abuse from a stepmother who made it clear I was unwanted. If that caused depression, it was a rational response to irrational cruelty, not a sign of mental deficiency." "You practice medicine without formal training or legal credentials." "I apprenticed with a licensed physician for 5 years. Women aren't allowed in medical schools, which means my education was necessarily informal. But the knowledge is real, and the patients I've treated would attest to its validity." "You married a man you'd known for only a few weeks." "I married a man who treated me with more respect in 3 weeks than my family showed me in 28 years. That's not impulsive. That's practical." Ashworth's smile tightened. "You don't deny that your family sent you west as part of a cruel prank?" "I don't deny it at all. In fact, I'm grateful. That prank freed me from a life of quiet desperation and gave me the chance to build something meaningful. So if my stepmother wants to take credit for my happiness, she's welcome to it." The courtroom stirred with whispers. Ashworth tried several more approaches, questioning Eleanor's judgment, her motivations, her understanding of legal marriage. But Eleanor answered every question with calm clarity, refusing to be painted as either victim or villain. Finally, Webb called his own witnesses. Tommy testified about Eleanor saving his life. Sarah Henderson described the blizzard rescue and Hope's birth. 3 other patients detailed medical treatments Eleanor had provided. A territorial official confirmed that Eleanor had broken no laws by providing medical care in a region with no other options. And then Rhett took the stand. Webb kept it simple. "Mr. Callahan, in your opinion, is Eleanor Callahan of sound mind and acting of her own free will?" "Absolutely. She's one of the smartest, most capable people I've ever met. The idea that she's being manipulated or controlled is absurd." "Did you coerce her into marriage?" "No. I offered her a partnership, practical, honest, mutually beneficial. She accepted on those terms. Everything since has been her choice, made with full awareness of consequences." "And if this court annuls your marriage?" Rhett looked directly at Margaret. "Then I'll ask her to marry me again the moment it's legal, because Eleanor Callahan is exactly who I want as my partner, and no court ruling will change that." The courtroom buzzed with reaction. Ashworth stood for cross-examination. Mr. Callahan, you're aware that annulling this marriage would free you from any legal obligation to Miss Blackthorne? I'm aware. And I'm telling you, it's not happening. You stand to lose a significant amount of money fighting this suit. Money isn't everything, Mr. Ashworth, though I understand that might be difficult for a Boston attorney to comprehend. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wade banged his gavel, but his mouth twitched with suppressed amusement. When all testimony concluded, Judge Wade called for a recess to review evidence. Eleanor sat in the hallway with Rhett and Marcus Webb, her hands shaking with spent tension. How do you think it went? Eleanor asked. Better than expected, Webb said. Wade is fair, and the evidence clearly shows you're competent, but judges can be unpredictable, especially when powerful Eastern families are involved. An hour later, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Wade surveyed the room with a stern expression that revealed nothing. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented, he said. The question before this court is whether Eleanor Blackthorne Callahan is mentally competent to make her own decisions regarding marriage and residence. Eleanor held her breath. Having heard extensive testimony about Mrs. Callahan's medical work, her community contributions, and her clear articulation of her own choices, I find no evidence whatsoever of mental incompetence. To the contrary, the evidence suggests a woman of exceptional capability and sound judgment. Margaret's face went pale. Furthermore, Wade continued, I find the attempt to use this court as a weapon in a family dispute to be both inappropriate and offensive. Mrs. Blackthorne's lawsuit is dismissed. The marriage stands. Mrs. Callahan is free to make her own choices about where and how she lives, and this court will not be used to enforce the social preferences of Boston society. He banged the gavel. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted in applause and chaos. Eleanor sat frozen, barely processing what had just happened. They'd won. The marriage was valid. Margaret's legal attack had failed completely. Rhett's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. It's over, he said quietly. Is it? She'll appeal. Find another angle. Margaret doesn't give up. Maybe not. But right now, in this moment, we won. Eleanor allowed herself to feel it. The victory. The validation. The simple fact that a court had looked at her life and declared her competent to live it. Across the courtroom, Margaret was speaking urgently with Ashworth, her face rigid with fury. She looked up and caught Eleanor's eye, and for a moment, pure hatred blazed between them. Then Margaret stood and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. Eleanor watched her go, feeling an unexpected emptiness. She'd prepared for more fighting, more attacks, more battle. The sudden absence of conflict felt strange. Come on, Rhett said, helping her stand. Let's go home. Home. The words settled into Eleanor's chest with surprising weight. Red Hollow was home now, not because it was perfect or easy, but because it was hers. She'd chosen it, fought for it, and built something real there. And no court ruling or family attack could take that away. The ride back to Red Hollow took 2 days, and Eleanor spent most of it waiting for the next attack. Margaret had walked out of that courtroom with murder in her eyes, and Eleanor knew her stepmother well enough to recognize that silence didn't mean surrender. It meant planning. But when they finally reached the ranch, exhausted and windburned from the journey, what waited for them wasn't an attack. It was celebration. Someone had strung lanterns across the ranch yard. Tables had been set up outside despite the cold, loaded with food that must have come from every kitchen in the valley. Ranch hands, neighbors, families Eleanor had treated, they'd all gathered, and when she and Rhett rode in, the entire crowd erupted in cheers. Eleanor stared at the chaos, completely unprepared. What is this? News travels fast out here, Maria said, appearing at Eleanor's stirrup to help her dismount. Telegram came yesterday saying you won. The whole territory's been celebrating since. Sarah Henderson pushed through the crowd, baby Hope bundled in her arms. You stood up to them, to all those Eastern families who think they can control everything out here, and you won. It was just a court hearing, Eleanor protested. No. This came from Tommy, standing with several other ranch hands. It was proof that people like us matter just as much as people like them, that they can't just push us around because they've got money and fancy names. The celebration lasted until midnight, despite the November cold. People shared stories about Eleanor, the injuries she'd treated, the medical advice she'd given, the way she'd ridden into a blizzard without hesitation. With each retelling, the stories grew slightly more dramatic, and Eleanor found herself becoming a figure she barely recognized. They're making me into some kind of frontier legend, she told Rhett, as they finally escaped to the porch, watching the last guest depart. I'm not that person. I just did what needed doing. That's exactly what makes you that person. Rhett leaned against the railing, his face shadowed in the lantern light. Most people know what needs doing. Very few actually do it, especially when it costs them something. It didn't cost me anything. I gained everything. You risked everything, Rhett corrected. Your safety, your reputation, your peace. You could have just accepted Margaret's version of your life. Most people would have. It's easier to let others define you than to fight for the right to define yourself. Eleanor thought about that, about the old version of herself who would have accepted cruelty as her natural state. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd left behind on a train platform months ago. I can't go back to being invisible, Eleanor said quietly, even if I wanted to. These people see me now. They expect things from me, and I don't know if I can live up to their expectations. You already are. Today, maybe. But what about tomorrow? What about the next patient I can't save? The next mistake I make? Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. What if I fail and prove Margaret right, that I was never capable of this? Rhett turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Eleanor, listen to me. You're going to fail sometimes. That's guaranteed. Medicine isn't perfect, and neither are you. Someone's going to die despite your best efforts. You're going to make a judgment call that turns out wrong. That's not proof of incompetence. That's proof you're human. But if I fail, then you learn from it and keep going. That's all any of us can do. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You've spent your whole life believing that one mistake would confirm what Margaret told you about yourself, that you're inherently flawed and unworthy. But that's not how worth works. You don't earn value through perfection. You have value because you exist, because you try, because you give a damn about doing right by people. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of being seen this way, of having someone believe in her competence even while acknowledging her limitations. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Any of this. Being married, being valued, being someone people depend on. I spent 28 years learning how to be invisible. I never learned how to be seen. Then we'll figure it out together. Rhett's hand found hers on the railing. That's what partnership means. You don't have to know everything. You just have to be willing to try. Inside the house, Maria was cleaning up the remnants of the celebration, and Eleanor could hear her humming something off-key but cheerful. The ranch hands had returned to their quarters, their laughter carrying across the yard. Everything felt settled and solid and real in ways Eleanor still struggled to believe. I keep thinking I'll wake up, she said, that this will all turn out to be some elaborate dream, and I'll be back in Boston, in that storage closet they called my room. If you do, I'll be having the same dream, which would be quite a coincidence. Eleanor laughed despite herself. You're not helpful. I'm extremely helpful. I'm just not comforting in the conventional way. Rhett's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, an absent gesture that he might not even be aware of. Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. The sudden seriousness in his tone made Eleanor's stomach tighten. All right. When I sent that letter to Boston asking for a wife, I had very specific expectations. I wanted someone educated who could handle the business side of the ranch, someone from a respectable family who would give me credibility with Eastern investors, someone who wouldn't expect romance or affection beyond basic courtesy. He paused. I thought I was hiring a business partner who happened to share my bed and name. I know. That's what we agreed to. Let me finish. Rhett's grip on her hand tightened slightly. What I got instead was someone who challenges me, surprises me, and makes me want to be better than I am. Someone who rode into a blizzard without hesitation and faced down her family's cruelty without flinching. Someone who looks at me like I'm worth her time instead of like I'm a means to an end. Eleanor's heart was hammering now. Rhett, what? I'm falling in love with you, he said quietly. I didn't plan to. I didn't want to. It complicates everything and makes me vulnerable in ways I've spent years avoiding. But it's happening anyway, and I needed you to know. The words hung in the cold November air between them. Eleanor's first instinct was to deflect, to make a joke, to protect herself from the terrifying possibility that he meant it. But she'd spent months learning to face fear instead of hiding from it. I don't know what love looks like, she said honestly. Margaret made sure I never learned. She convinced me I was incapable of inspiring it and unworthy of receiving it. So I don't have the right words or the right feelings or whatever you're supposed to say when someone tells you something like that. You don't have to say anything. But I want to. Eleanor turned to face him fully. I want to tell you that when you look at me, I feel like a real person instead of a mistake someone's trying to hide. I want to tell you that I trust you in ways I've never trusted anyone. I want to tell you that the thought of losing this, losing you, terrifies me more than any of Margaret's attacks ever did. That's not nothing, Rhett said softly. It's not love, or at least I don't think it is, but it might be the beginning of it. Eleanor managed a shaky smile. Is that enough? It's more than enough. Rhett pulled her closer, and Eleanor let herself lean into the embrace, her head against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat, steady and real, and undeniable proof that this moment was actually happening. They stood like that for a long time, the cold forgotten, the celebration debris scattered around them, the ranch quiet except for distant night sounds, and the occasional horse shifting in the barn. Finally, Rhett said, "We should go inside. You're freezing." "I am not." "Your teeth are chattering." Eleanor realized he was right. The adrenaline of the court victory and the emotional confession had faded, leaving her aware of just how cold November nights got in Colorado. Inside, the house was warm from the fires Maria had kept going. They found her in the kitchen, finishing the last of the cleanup. "About time," Maria said without looking up. "I was beginning to think you'd frozen to that porch." "We were talking," Eleanor said. "I'm sure you were." Maria's tone was dry but amused. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry, and mail came while you were gone. Left it on Rhett's desk. Mail." Eleanor felt the familiar anxiety return. Any correspondence could be another attack from Margaret, another legal maneuver, another attempt to destroy what they'd built. But when Rhett retrieved the stack of letters, most were business correspondence, cattle orders, supply invoices, railroad contract updates. The only personal letter was addressed to Eleanor in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it carefully. "Dear Mrs. Callahan, my name is Dr. Catherine Morrison. I'm a physician in San Francisco, one of the few women who managed to obtain medical training in Europe, where the restrictions are somewhat less stringent than in America. I recently read about your court victory in the newspapers, and I was particularly struck by your testimony regarding your medical work. The frontier desperately needs qualified practitioners, and the fact that you've been providing competent care despite the legal and social barriers facing women in medicine is commendable. I'm writing to invite you to San Francisco to participate in a gathering of women physicians and medical practitioners from across the Western territories. We meet twice yearly to share knowledge, discuss cases, and support each other's work. I believe you would find it valuable, and I know the other practitioners would benefit from your frontier experience. The next gathering is scheduled for January 1876. All expenses would be covered. Please consider joining us. Sincerely, Dr. Catherine Morrison." Eleanor read it twice, then handed it to Rhett without comment. He scanned it quickly. "You should go. It's 2 months away, and San Francisco is a week's travel by train. I know. You should still go." "What about the ranch? The patients here?" "Eleanor, the ranch survived before you arrived. It'll survive a few weeks without you, and your patients will still be here when you get back." Rhett set the letter down. "This is an opportunity to learn from other practitioners, to expand your knowledge. You'd be foolish not to take it." "You wouldn't mind? Me leaving for that long?" "I'd mind, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't go." He smiled slightly. "I'm capable of surviving without you for a few weeks. Barely, but still capable." Eleanor thought about it. The idea of meeting other women doing similar work, of learning from trained physicians, of being part of a community that understood the unique challenges of practicing medicine as a woman. It was tempting in ways she hadn't expected. "I'll think about it," she said. "Think quickly. You'll need to send a response." Over the next few weeks, life settled into something resembling routine. Eleanor continued her medical work, treating injuries, delivering babies, teaching basic care to anyone who wanted to learn. Rhett managed the ranch business, negotiating railroad contracts and planning for spring calving season. They fell into comfortable patterns of working separately during the day and comparing notes over dinner each evening. But underneath the routine, Eleanor felt the tension building. Margaret had been silent for too long. No letters, no telegrams, no new attacks, just silence that felt more ominous than any threat. "She's planning something," Eleanor told Sarah Chen during one of their regular afternoon sessions where Eleanor taught basic medical skills to interested women. "Margaret doesn't quit. She just regroups." "Maybe she finally accepted defeat," Sarah suggested, practicing bandaging techniques on a wooden mannequin Eleanor had improvised from ranch supplies. "You don't know her. Defeat just makes her angrier and more determined." Eleanor adjusted Sarah's bandage wrap. A little tighter there. You want to provide support without cutting off circulation. But what else can she do? The court ruled in your favor. The newspapers printed your side of the story. Even Boston society knows the truth now. Truth doesn't matter to Margaret. Power does. And she still has money, connections, and a pathological need to punish me for escaping. Eleanor stepped back, examining Sarah's work. That's perfect. Try it again on the other arm. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching fast. Eleanor and Sarah went to the window and saw Rhett riding in with another man Eleanor didn't recognize, someone in a dark suit with an official-looking document case. Eleanor's stomach dropped. More legal papers, more attacks. But when Rhett brought the man inside, his expression was oddly neutral, not angry or worried, just carefully controlled. Eleanor, this is Mr. James Patterson. He's an attorney from Boston. Eleanor's hands clenched. What does my stepmother want now? Patterson looked uncomfortable. I'm not here representing Mrs. Margaret Blackthorne. I'm here representing your father, William Blackthorne. That was unexpected enough to throw Eleanor completely off balance. My father? Why would he need an attorney? Because he's filed for divorce from Margaret Blackthorne, and he wants to restore your inheritance before the proceedings finalize. Eleanor stared at him. I'm sorry, what? Patterson opened his document case and pulled out several papers. Your father contacted my firm 3 weeks ago. He wants to divorce Mrs. Blackthorne on grounds of cruelty and fraud. He claims she manipulated him into disinheriting you and allowing you to be sent west under false pretenses. My father barely spoke to me for 10 years. Why would he suddenly... The court hearing in Denver was widely publicized. Your father read the transcripts. He saw how Mrs. Blackthorne characterized her treatment of you, how she attempted to use the legal system to force you back to Boston. Patterson paused. According to his letter to my firm, he was unaware of the full extent of her cruelty until he saw it documented in court proceedings. Eleanor laughed, but it came out harsh and bitter. He was there. He watched it happen. He just never cared enough to intervene. Perhaps, or perhaps he was easier to manipulate than either of you realized. Regardless, he's taking action now. He wants to restore your full inheritance, your mother's estate, which was held in trust. And he wants to ensure Mrs. Blackthorne receives nothing in the divorce settlement. How much are we talking about? Rhett asked quietly. Patterson named a figure that made Eleanor's vision blur slightly. Her mother's family had been wealthy merchants, and apparently that wealth had been held in trust all these years, legally Eleanor's but controlled by her father as long as she remained unmarried. That can't be right, Eleanor said. That's enough to buy half the territory. It's enough to ensure your independence for the rest of your life, Patterson confirmed. Your father wants you to have it. He says it's the least he can do to make amends for years of neglect. Eleanor sat down heavily. Money. Actual, substantial money. The kind of wealth that meant she'd never be dependent on anyone, never be vulnerable to being discarded or controlled. The kind of wealth that meant she didn't need to stay married to Rhett for security. She looked up and found Rhett watching her with an expression she couldn't read. There's one condition, Patterson continued. Your father wants to see you, to apologize in person. He's asking if you'd be willing to return to Boston just for a brief visit, so he can explain himself and sign the necessary papers transferring the inheritance. Absolutely not, Rhett said immediately. Eleanor held up a hand. Let him finish. He understands your reluctance, Patterson said. He's prepared to travel here if necessary, though the journey would be difficult for him given his health. His health? He's been unwell for several months. The stress of the divorce proceedings has worsened his condition. Patterson pulled out another letter. He wrote this for you. Perhaps it explains better than I can. Eleanor took the letter with shaking hands. The handwriting was her father's, weaker than she remembered, but recognizable. My dear Eleanor, I have been a coward. There is no other word for it. For 10 years I watched Margaret treat you with subtle cruelty, and I told myself it wasn't my concern, that women's matters were best left to women. That you were strong enough to handle it. I was wrong. I was weak. And my weakness allowed the daughter I loved to suffer in silence. Reading the court transcripts broke something in me. Seeing in black and white exactly what Margaret did. How she orchestrated your humiliation. How she tried to destroy the life you built. I finally understood the full scope of my failure as a father. I cannot undo the past. I cannot give you back the years I stole through my neglect. But I can give you what your mother wanted you to have. Independence, security, freedom from ever being controlled or discarded again. Please accept this inheritance, not as payment for my sins, but as the birthright your mother intended. You earned it by surviving despite my cowardice. And if you can find it in your heart to see me one last time, I would count it as more mercy than I deserve. Your father, William Blackthorne. Eleanor read it 3 times, her emotions a tangled mess. Anger at years of abandonment. Suspicion that this was another manipulation. But also, surprisingly, a thread of old grief for the father she'd once had before Margaret entered their lives. I need to think about this, she said finally. Patterson nodded. Take your time. I'm staying at the hotel in Red Hollow. Send word when you've decided. After he left, Eleanor sat in the ranch office staring at the letter while Rhett stood by the window, his back rigid with tension. You're not seriously considering going back to Boston, he said finally. I'm considering seeing my father one last time before he dies. That's not the same thing. It's a trap. Margaret is behind this somehow. Maybe. Probably. But what if it's not? What if my father genuinely wants to make amends? Eleanor set the letter down. And what if I refuse to see him and spend the rest of my life wondering if I threw away a chance at closure out of fear? Rhett turned to face her. The inheritance changes things. Does it? Eleanor, that kind of money means you don't need me. You don't need this ranch. You could go anywhere, do anything. Build your own medical practice in a real city with proper facilities. Is that what you think I want? I don't know what you want. 3 months ago, you were desperate enough to marry a stranger just to escape Boston. Now you have enough money to go anywhere and do anything. The circumstances that brought you here no longer exist. Eleanor stood up, frustrated. So you think the only reason I'm staying is because I have nowhere else to go? That this marriage is just convenience and I'll abandon it the moment I have better options? I think you deserve better options, Rhett shot back. I think you deserve the chance to choose this life because you want it, not because it's the best available escape from worse alternatives. I am choosing it. I choose it every day. Do you? Or are you just so used to settling for less than you deserve that you can't imagine anything better? The words hit Eleanor like a slap. She stared at Rhett, seeing the fear underneath his anger. He was protecting himself, building walls, preparing for her to leave now that she had the means to do so. I'm going to San Francisco in January, Eleanor said quietly. For that medical conference Dr. Morrison invited me to. I'm going to meet other women practitioners and learn from trained physicians and see what opportunities might exist outside Red Hollow. Rhett's jaw tightened. And then I'm coming back here. Because this is my home. Not because I'm trapped here or because I have no better options, but because I built something real here. With you. And I'm not abandoning that just because an inheritance gives me other choices. You can't know that. You haven't seen San Francisco yet. You haven't explored what that money could buy. You're right. I haven't. So I'm going to do exactly what you suggested earlier. I'm going to take that opportunity to learn and grow and see what else exists. And when I come back, you'll know that I chose this, actively, deliberately, not out of desperation, but out of genuine want. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, And your father? I'll see him. Here, in Red Hollow, where I have control and support. Not in Boston, where Margaret can orchestrate another attack. If he's genuine about making amends, he can make the journey. If he's not, well, then I'll have my answer. And if it's dangerous, if Margaret uses it as an opportunity to hurt you, then I'll handle it. The same way I've handled everything else she's thrown at me. Eleanor walked over to stand in front of him. Rhett, I'm not that terrified woman who stepped off the train months ago. I'm not helpless or easily manipulated, and I'm not going to let fear of what Margaret might do control my decisions about my own father. Rhett studied her face, and Eleanor watched his walls come down slightly. Not completely, but enough. Send word to Patterson, he said finally. Tell him your father can come here if he wants to see you, and tell him to schedule it for after you return from San Francisco. After? Because you're going to that conference. You're going to meet those physicians and explore those opportunities. And then you're going to make informed decisions about what you actually want instead of just reacting to what others force on you. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. You're not trying to keep me here? I'm trying to make sure you stay because you want to, not because you feel obligated. Rhett's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. 3 months ago, I would have done anything to keep you from leaving, but that's not love. That's possession. And you deserve better than that. What if I come back different? What if San Francisco shows me a life I want more than this one? Then I'll be devastated. But I'll survive. And you'll be happy, which matters more. He smiled slightly. though I'm counting on the fact that big cities have nothing on blizzard rescues and dramatic court victories. Eleanor laughed despite the tears threatening to spill. You're really okay with this? Me leaving for weeks, seeing my father, potentially changing everything? I'm terrified, but I'm also sure that trying to control you would destroy whatever we're building faster than any of Margaret's attacks could. Rhett pulled her closer. So yes, go to San Francisco, see your father, figure out what you actually want. And if what you want is still here when you get back, I'll be waiting. Eleanor leaned into the embrace, letting herself feel the fear and hope and possibility all tangled together. She was choosing uncertainty over safety, growth over comfort, truth over convenient lies. Margaret had sent her west expecting her to fail and crawl back defeated. Instead, Eleanor had built a life strong enough to survive her own choices, including the choice to temporarily leave it behind to see what else existed. That night, Eleanor wrote 2 letters. The first was to Patterson, agreeing to see her father, but only in Red Hollow and only after she returned from San Francisco in February. If William Blackthorne was genuine about making amends, he could make the effort to come to her. The second was to Dr. Morrison, accepting the invitation to the medical conference and asking for information about opportunities for women practitioners in San Francisco. She sealed both letters before she could second-guess herself and handed them to Rhett the next morning for posting. No regrets? He asked. Hundreds of regrets, Eleanor admitted. But I'm doing it anyway. That's growth, right? That's courage. The weeks leading up to her departure were filled with preparation. Eleanor trained Sarah Chen and 2 other women in basic emergency care, creating detailed notes on common injuries and treatments. She organized all her medical supplies and documented every case she'd handled, creating a reference library for anyone who might need it while she was gone. She also spent long evenings with Rhett, talking about everything and nothing, ranch business and childhood memories and hopes for the future. They were learning each other in ways that went beyond the practical partnership they'd started with, building something deeper and more complicated. And every night, Eleanor went to bed wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. If leaving meant losing everything she'd built, if exploring other options meant she'd discover she wanted something other than this. But she was done making decisions out of fear. On the first day of January 1876, Eleanor boarded the westbound train with a trunk full of practical clothes, a case full of medical texts, and a heart full of conflicting emotions. Rhett stood on the platform, his expression carefully neutral except for his eyes, which held everything he wasn't saying. Come back, he said quietly as the train whistle blew. I will. Promise me. Eleanor looked at this man who'd shown her what respect looked like, who'd fought beside her against impossible odds, who was letting her go despite being terrified she wouldn't return. I promise, she said, not because I owe you, but because I want to. Because what we're building here matters more than any opportunity waiting in San Francisco. Rhett pulled her into a kiss that held nothing back, all the fear and hope and love he'd been carefully controlling. When he finally released her, Eleanor had to grip the train railing to stay steady. That was unfair, she said breathlessly. I know, but I wanted to make sure you remembered what you're coming back to. Eleanor laughed and climbed aboard the train, finding a window seat so she could watch Rhett standing alone on the platform as the train pulled away. She watched Red Hollow disappear behind her, the ranch and the mountains and everything she'd built becoming small in the distance. And for the first time, she wasn't running from something. She was running toward something, toward knowledge and growth and the kind of choices that came from confidence instead of desperation. Margaret had tried to destroy her by sending her away. Instead, she'd taught Eleanor that leaving didn't mean losing. Sometimes it meant finding out exactly how strong you'd become. San Francisco was nothing like Red Hollow. The city sprawled across hills that dropped into a harbor crowded with ships from every corner of the world. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, their facades painted in colors Eleanor had forgotten existed after months of frontier wood and stone. The streets teemed with people, Chinese laborers, Mexican merchants, European immigrants, all speaking languages that blended into a constant hum of urban chaos. Eleanor stood on the deck of the ferry crossing the bay, watching the city grow larger, and felt her confidence waver. Red Hollow had accepted her because she was useful. Here, she was nobody, just another woman in a city full of them, with medical knowledge that might mean nothing to trained physicians who'd studied in actual universities. Dr. Catherine Morrison met her at the dock, a tall woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and eyes that assessed Eleanor in seconds. Mrs. Callahan, I'm Catherine Morrison. Welcome to San Francisco. Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Morrison. Call me Catherine. We're not formal here. Can't afford to be when half of society already thinks we're unsuitable for our profession. She gestured toward a waiting carriage. How was your journey? Long, and I'm not used to cities anymore. You'll adjust. Or you won't, which would also tell you something useful. Catherine helped Eleanor into the carriage with brisk efficiency. The conference starts tomorrow. Tonight you'll stay with me so we can talk properly. I want to hear about your frontier work before you're overwhelmed by 20 other women asking similar questions. Catherine's home was a modest two-story house in a residential neighborhood with a ground floor converted into a medical practice. The waiting room held evidence of recent patients, discarded bandages, the smell of carbolic acid, a sign on the wall listing treatment hours. You run your practice from home? Eleanor asked. Cheaper than renting separate space, and patients seem more comfortable coming to a home than to an official office. Makes it feel less intimidating. Catherine led her upstairs to a simple guest room. Put your things down and join me in the kitchen. I want to hear everything. Over strong coffee and cold chicken, Eleanor told Catherine about her work in Red Hollow, the blizzard rescue, the court hearing, the patients she'd treated with improvised supplies and knowledge gleaned from unauthorized apprenticeship. Catherine listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Eleanor finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You know you're practicing medicine illegally, Catherine said finally. I know, but the alternative was letting people die for lack of care. I'm not criticizing. I'm stating fact. Catherine refilled their coffee cups. Everything you've done, every life you've saved, every treatment you've provided, it's all technically illegal because you're a woman without formal credentials, and the medical establishment would very much like to punish you for it if they could. Eleanor felt cold. Is that why you invited me here? To warn me? I invited you here because you're doing important work and you deserve support. But I also needed you to understand the reality. Catherine leaned forward. There are perhaps 50 women in this entire country who practice medicine with any level of legitimacy. Some of us trained in Europe. Some bullied our way into American schools that reluctantly admitted women. Some, like you, learned through apprenticeship and sheer determination. But all of us operate in legal and social gray areas that could be revoked at any moment. So what do I do? You keep working. You document everything. You build a reputation so solid that attacking you means attacking all the people whose lives you've saved. And you connect with other women doing similar work because we're stronger together than separately. The conference started the next morning in a borrowed lecture hall at a women's college. Eleanor walked in expecting maybe a dozen attendees and found over 30 women, doctors, midwives, nurses, and practitioners of various specialties. They came from Portland, Denver, Seattle, Los Angeles, and smaller towns scattered across the West. For 3 days, they shared knowledge. A surgeon from Portland demonstrated new suturing techniques. A midwife from Denver discussed managing difficult births. A nurse from Seattle presented research on infection prevention. Eleanor found herself taking notes frantically, absorbing information that would have taken years to learn through trial and error. On the second day, she presented her own case, the blizzard rescue and Hope's birth. She expected polite interest at best and criticism at worst for her improvised methods. Instead, she got a standing ovation. You did emergency obstetrics in a frontier cabin during a snowstorm with no proper equipment, a doctor named Sarah Whitman said afterward. That's not just competent, that's exceptional. Most trained physicians couldn't have managed it. I got lucky, Eleanor protested. Luck is what you call skill when you're too modest to claim credit. Sarah was perhaps 30, with the confident bearing of someone who'd fought hard for her credentials. Eleanor, you're wasting yourself in a tiny frontier town. San Francisco has 3 hospitals that desperately need competent practitioners. With your experience and my connections, I could get you a position within a month. Eleanor's heart stuttered. A real medical position, in a real hospital, with proper equipment and trained colleagues and the chance to learn from actual doctors instead of just muddling through on her own. What kind of position? She asked carefully. Probably nursing to start. Hospitals won't hire women as physicians regardless of competence. But you'd be working in a surgical ward, assisting with procedures, learning techniques that don't exist in frontier medicine. Within a year or 2, you could be running your own ward, maybe even training other women. It was everything Eleanor hadn't known she wanted. Recognition from the medical establishment, access to resources that didn't exist in Red Hollow, the chance to work alongside people who understood the complexity of medicine instead of just being grateful someone knew more than nothing. I'm married, Eleanor said. My husband runs a ranch in Colorado. So? Plenty of married women work. Your husband could move here if he wanted, or you could visit each other periodically. People make it work. Eleanor thought about Rhett standing on that train platform, telling her to explore her options, trusting her to come back even though it meant risking everything. Can I think about it? Eleanor asked. Of course. The offer stands for 6 months. After that, the position will likely go to someone else. Sarah smiled. But Eleanor, don't waste this opportunity out of misplaced loyalty. You're too talented to bury yourself in the wilderness. That night, Eleanor wrote Rhett a letter she rewrote 5 times before settling on words that felt honest. Rhett, San Francisco is remarkable. The medical community here is doing work I never imagined possible. I've learned more in 3 days than I learned in 3 years of apprenticeship. A doctor here offered me a hospital position. Real work with real resources. The chance to be more than just a frontier practitioner, hoping I remember enough to keep people alive. I don't know what I'm going to do. Part of me wants to accept immediately. Part of me wants to run back to Red Hollow and pretend this opportunity doesn't exist. I promised I'd come back. And I will. But I need you to know that coming back might be harder than I expected. I'm sorry. That's probably not what you wanted to hear. Eleanor. She mailed it before she could change her mind, then spent the rest of the conference trying to focus on learning instead of spiraling into anxiety about her future. On the final day, Catherine pulled her aside. You're struggling with something. Want to talk about it? Eleanor told her about the hospital offer, about Rhett, about the impossible choice between the life she'd built and the life she could have. Catherine listened quietly, then said, Can I tell you a story? Please? 20 years ago, I was engaged to a man in Philadelphia. Nice man, good family, perfectly acceptable marriage. I was also determined to become a doctor, which he found charming in a theoretical way, but horrifying as an actual plan. He told me I had to choose, marriage or medicine. I couldn't have both. What did you do? I chose medicine, broke the engagement, moved to Europe to study, came back to San Francisco and built a practice from nothing. Spent 20 years wondering if I'd made a mistake, if I'd sacrificed love and family for a career that society barely recognized as legitimate. Do you regret it? Some days, yes. When I'm alone on holidays watching other families celebrate. When I see mothers with children and wonder what that might have been like. When I'm too old and tired to enjoy the freedom I fought so hard to achieve. Catherine paused. But most days, no. Because I've saved lives. I've trained other women. I've proven that we're just as capable as men of doing this work. And that matters more than the alternative life I gave up. That doesn't help me decide, Eleanor said. It's not supposed to. Because your situation is different. Your husband isn't making you choose. He's supporting whatever decision you make, which is both better and worse. Better because you have options, worse because you can't blame anyone else for the choice. Eleanor laughed bitterly. So how do I decide? You ask yourself what you'll regret more, missing this opportunity or leaving behind what you've built. Catherine's expression softened. There's no right answer, Eleanor. There's just the answer you can live with. Eleanor spent her last night in San Francisco walking the city streets, trying to imagine a life here. She could see herself in that hospital, learning from trained surgeons, becoming the kind of doctor she'd always wanted to be. She could see herself building a reputation, maybe eventually opening her own practice, contributing to the growing movement of women in medicine. But she could also see herself alone in a boarding house, writing letters to Rhett that grew more distant over time, visiting Red Hollow on holidays like a stranger returning to a place she used to know. She thought about Margaret's old accusations, that Eleanor was incapable of inspiring love, unworthy of real partnership, destined to be alone and discarded. And she realized that accepting the hospital position out of fear of losing what she had would just be another way of proving Margaret right. It would mean she still didn't believe she deserved to be chosen, that Rhett's love was fragile enough to break under the weight of her ambitions. But staying in Red Hollow out of fear that nothing better existed would be just as bad. It would mean she was still that terrified woman who accepted the first decent option because she couldn't imagine deserving more. The choice wasn't between 2 different lives. It was between 2 different versions of herself. The one who let fear make her decisions, and the one who made decisions despite the fear. Eleanor boarded the eastbound train 2 days later with no clear answers, just a desperate hope that seeing Red Hollow again would somehow clarify everything. The journey took 6 days. Eleanor spent most of it staring out the window at the changing landscape, watching California give way to Nevada, Nevada to Utah, Utah to Colorado. Somewhere around the second day, she stopped trying to make lists of pros and cons and just let herself feel. She felt the pull of San Francisco's possibilities, the medical advancement, the community of women practitioners, the chance to be more than just a frontier doctor making do with limited resources. But she also felt the pull of Red Hollow, the patients who trusted her, the community that had rallied around her, the partnership she and Rhett had built through shared battles and mutual respect. And underneath both, she felt something she'd never experienced before, the knowledge that either choice was valid, that she wasn't trapped or desperate or accepting whatever scraps life offered. She was choosing between two genuine opportunities, both of which had merit. That realization hit her somewhere in the mountains of western Colorado, and Eleanor started crying without quite understanding why. Maybe because it was the first time in her life she'd had real choices. Maybe because choosing meant losing something valuable no matter what. Maybe because she finally understood what Rhett had been trying to tell her, that she deserved to want things instead of just accepting them. The train pulled into Red Hollow late on a February afternoon, snow falling in lazy spirals that caught the last of the daylight. Eleanor stepped onto the platform with her trunk and her medical case and her heart in her throat. Rhett was there. He looked thinner than she remembered, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd slept about as well as she had over the past 6 weeks. But his face when he saw her, relief and hope and fear all mixed together, told Eleanor everything she needed to know about whether he'd been waiting with confidence or desperate uncertainty. "You came back," he said. "I promised I would." Promises can be broken. Not by me, not to you. They stared at each other across 10 feet of snowy platform, neither moving, both terrified of what came next. Finally, Eleanor said, "I was offered a hospital position in San Francisco. Real medical work with trained physicians and proper resources. Everything I never knew I could want." Rhett's jaw tightened. And I turned it down. Why? Because I realized something in San Francisco. I could be a good doctor there, maybe even a great one. I could learn advanced techniques and contribute to women's medical education and build a reputation that might actually matter. Eleanor walked toward him slowly. But I could never build what we have, the partnership, the trust, the feeling of being chosen instead of just accepted. That's irreplaceable, and I wasn't willing to trade it for career advancement. Eleanor, let me finish. I need to say this while I still have the courage. She stopped directly in front of him. I love you. I don't know when it happened or how to describe it properly because I've never felt it before. But that's what this is. I love you enough to choose you over every other opportunity, and I need you to know that's not settling. It's not fear. It's just wanting to build a life with you more than I want anything else. Rhett pulled her into his arms so hard she lost her breath. I was terrified you wouldn't come back. Every day for 6 weeks, I woke up wondering if this was the day I'd get a letter saying you'd found something better. There's nothing better than this, than us. What about your medical work? The hospital position? Was one option, but Red Hollow needs a doctor too, and maybe I can build something here that's just as valuable as what I'd have done in San Francisco. Maybe I can train other practitioners, bring more advanced techniques to the frontier, create a medical practice that serves this community properly. Eleanor pulled back to look at him. I don't need a hospital to be a good doctor. I just need to keep learning and working and doing right by my patients. Rhett was quiet for a moment, his hands framing her face. What if I told you I'd sell the ranch and move to San Francisco if that's what you really wanted? I'd tell you you're an idiot for offering, and I love you more for it. And what if I told you I've been negotiating with the territorial governor to establish a proper medical clinic in Red Hollow with funding for supplies and equipment? Eleanor stared at him. You what? You're not the only one who spent 6 weeks thinking about the future. I can't give you a hospital, but I can give you the resources to build something real here. A clinic that serves the whole territory, with funding for equipment and supplies and maybe even assistance. Rhett smiled slightly. I pulled every political favor I had to make it happen. The governor agreed last week. Why would you do that? Because keeping you here by limiting your options would be the same as Margaret's cruelty in a different form. I wanted you to come back knowing you could have a real medical practice here, not just improvised frontier care, but actual professional work that might satisfy that brilliant mind of yours. Eleanor felt tears burning. You manipulative, wonderful man. Is that a yes to staying? It's a yes to everything. Staying, building the clinic, loving you despite your tendency to make grand gestures without asking. She kissed him, tasting snow and relief and the particular flavor of coming home. But there's one more thing we need to deal with. Your father. My father. William Blackthorne arrived in Red Hollow 3 weeks later, traveling with a private physician and looking 20 years older than Eleanor remembered. The journey from Boston had clearly cost him. He moved slowly, with the careful caution of someone managing constant pain. Eleanor met him at the hotel, her emotions carefully controlled. Rhett had offered to come with her, but this conversation needed to happen alone. Her father stood when she entered the room, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. "Eleanor," he said finally, "you look well." "I am well." I'm glad." He gestured to a chair. "Will you sit? I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I would appreciate the chance to explain." Eleanor sat, keeping her spine straight and her hands folded. "You have 15 minutes. William nodded, accepting the limitation. "I was a coward. For 10 years, I watched Margaret treat you with cruelty that I told myself wasn't my concern. I convinced myself that women's matters were best left to women, that you were strong enough to handle it, that interfering would only make things worse." "Those were excuses," Eleanor said flatly, "not explanations." "You're right. The truth is that after your mother died, I was lost. Margaret offered stability and social connection and a way to avoid dealing with my grief. It was easier to let her manage the household than to acknowledge how badly I was failing you." "You didn't fail me. You abandoned me." William flinched but didn't argue. "Yes, I did. And I have no excuse that would make that acceptable. But I want you to know that I was never unaware of what I was doing. I knew Margaret was cruel. I knew you were suffering. I just chose not to act. And that makes it worse, not better." Eleanor stared at this man who had given her life, and then spent years proving that biological connection meant nothing without actual care. "Why now?" she asked. "Why finally take action after a decade of silence?" "Because reading those court transcripts broke something in me. Seeing in legal language exactly what Margaret had done, how she'd sent you west as a joke, how she'd tried to destroy the life you'd built, I couldn't pretend anymore that my inaction was harmless." He paused. "And because I'm dying. The doctors give me perhaps 6 months, and I wanted to make one thing right before I left this world. The inheritance. Your mother's family fortune. It was held in trust for you, but I controlled it while you were unmarried. Margaret convinced me that giving you access would make you dangerously independent, that you needed family guidance to avoid making foolish choices." William pulled out a folder of legal documents. "These transfer everything to you immediately. No conditions, no strings. It's what your mother wanted, and it's the least I can do to make amends." Eleanor looked at the papers without touching them. "Money doesn't fix what you did." "I know. Nothing can fix it, but it can ensure you never have to depend on anyone's charity or tolerance again. You'll have complete independence for the rest of your life." "I already have independence. I built it myself out here." "I know. I've read the newspaper accounts, the medical work, the court victory, the reputation you've earned. You became exactly what your mother hoped you'd be. Strong, capable, unwilling to accept cruelty as your natural state." William's voice cracked. "I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to that pride, but I am." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained control slipping. Part of her wanted to rage at this man for all the years of neglect. Part of her wanted to accept his apology and pretend it made everything better. But the larger part, the part that had learned hard truths in the frontier, knew that closure was messier than either anger or forgiveness. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly. "I can't. Not yet. And maybe not ever. The damage you allowed goes too deep." "I understand. But I'll take the inheritance. Not as payment for your sins, but because it's mine, and because I've learned not to refuse things I've earned out of pride or spite." Eleanor reached for the documents. "And I'll acknowledge that you're trying to make amends, even if it's too little and too late. That's more than I expected from you." William nodded, tears running down his weathered face. "That's more grace than I deserve. Probably. But I'm not giving it for you. I'm giving it for me because carrying hatred is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my energy." They talked for another hour, awkward, painful conversation that didn't resolve decades of hurt, but acknowledged it honestly. William asked about her medical work, and Eleanor found herself describing the clinic plans with genuine enthusiasm. He asked about Rhett, and Eleanor told him about the partnership they'd built through adversity. "He's a good man," William said. "Better than I was. He sees your value instead of taking it for granted." "Yes, he does. That's all I wanted for you, someone who would treat you with the respect and care I failed to provide." William stood slowly, his exhaustion evident. I won't ask to stay in contact. I know I don't have the right, but if you ever want to write, if you ever want to tell me about the life you're building, I would treasure it. Eleanor stood as well, considering. I'll think about it. That's all I can promise. It's enough. They parted with a handshake rather than an embrace, a formal acknowledgement of biological connection without pretending it equaled actual relationship. Eleanor watched her father leave, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and relief. She'd gotten closure, but not the kind movies promised. No tearful reconciliation, no magical healing of old wounds. Just an honest acknowledgement of damage done, and the faint possibility that time might eventually soften the edges. It was enough. That evening, Eleanor sat with Rhett on the ranch porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. How do you feel? Rhett asked. Exhausted, relieved, sad for what could have been if he'd been a different person. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. But also free. I don't have to wonder anymore if he cared or if I imagined the neglect. He admitted it all, and that means I can stop carrying the weight of maybe being wrong about my own experiences. And the inheritance is substantial enough that we could build 10 medical clinics if we wanted, or expand the ranch, or fund education for women who want medical training. Eleanor smiled. I'm thinking about all three. Of course you are. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the mountains. Around them, the ranch settled into evening routines, horses moving in the corrals, ranch hands heading toward dinner, Maria's voice carrying from the kitchen as she scolded someone for tracking mud inside. This was Eleanor's life now, not the one she'd been born into or the one Margaret had tried to force on her, but the one she'd built through choices made despite fear and uncertainty. I got a letter from Vivian yesterday, Eleanor said quietly. Rhett raised an eyebrow. What did she want? To tell me that Margaret's reputation in Boston is completely destroyed. No one will receive her socially. Her divorce from my father is proceeding with maximum scandal, and Vivian is engaged to a lawyer from Philadelphia, someone Margaret considers beneath their station, but who apparently treats Vivian with actual respect. How do you feel about that? Happy for her, I think. She's escaping the same trap I did, just through a different path. Eleanor paused. She asked if she could visit sometime, to see what my life looks like out here, to maybe learn how to stop defining herself by Margaret's expectations. What did you tell her? That she's welcome. Not to stay permanently, but to visit and see that there are other ways to live beyond what Boston society dictates. Eleanor looked at Rhett. Is that okay? Having my sister here? Eleanor, this is your home too. You don't need my permission to invite family. She's not really family, not in any meaningful way. We barely know each other beyond shared cruelty. Then maybe visiting could change that, or maybe it won't, and that's fine too. Rhett pulled her closer. You're allowed to want relationships with people, even if they're complicated. You're allowed to hope they'll do better, without guaranteeing they will. Eleanor thought about that, about extending grace to Vivian the same way she'd offered limited grace to her father, about allowing people to grow beyond who they'd been without pretending the past didn't exist. When did you become so wise about human relationships? She asked. I'm not wise. I just learned from watching you navigate impossible situations with more grace than anyone has a right to expect. 2 months later, the Red Hollow Medical Clinic opened in a new building constructed specifically for the purpose. It had proper examination rooms, storage for supplies and equipment, and even a small surgical space for emergency procedures. The territorial governor attended the opening ceremony, along with half the valley's population. Eleanor stood in front of the crowd, feeling the familiar anxiety of being seen. But this time, instead of trying to hide, she spoke clearly about her vision, a medical practice that served everyone regardless of ability to pay, that trained other practitioners to spread knowledge throughout the territory, that proved women were just as capable as men of providing quality care. The applause was thunderous. Sarah Chen and Martha Williams became Eleanor's first official assistants, learning advanced techniques and helping manage the patient load that grew exponentially once word spread about the professional clinic. Tommy, the ranch hand whose life Eleanor had saved on her first day in Red Hollow, married one of the women Eleanor had trained and opened a small infirmary in a neighboring settlement. The network of frontier medical care grew slowly but steadily, built on the foundation Eleanor had started with nothing but borrowed knowledge and desperate courage. Vivian visited in late spring, arriving on the same train Eleanor had taken months earlier. She looked smaller than Eleanor remembered, less polished, less confident, more uncertain about her place in the world. They spent a week together, talking through years of complicated history. Vivian apologized repeatedly for her participation in Margaret's cruelty, and Eleanor accepted without pretending the apologies erased the damage. They weren't going to be close sisters who confided everything, but they managed something like friendly acquaintances working toward mutual respect. "You built all this," Vivian said on her last day, standing in the clinic and looking at the organized supplies and medical texts and evidence of professional work. "Starting from nothing." "Starting from spite and desperation, actually," Eleanor corrected. "The building came later." "Still, you took what Margaret meant as destruction and turned it into something remarkable." Vivian paused. "I want that. The courage to build something for myself instead of just accepting whatever marriage or social position gets assigned to me." "Then do it. You have the inheritance from father's divorce settlement. You have education and intelligence. You have the example of watching me prove it's possible. The only thing missing is the decision to actually try." "What if I fail?" "Then you fail and try something else. Failure isn't fatal, Vivian. Giving up without trying is." Vivian left Red Hollow looking thoughtful, and Eleanor received a letter 2 months later saying her sister had broken her engagement to the Philadelphia lawyer and enrolled in a teaching college instead. Margaret was apparently apoplectic with rage, which Vivian described with barely concealed satisfaction. Eleanor smiled reading it and filed the letter away with all the others that documented her growing collection of genuine relationships. Messy, complicated, imperfect connections that meant more than any polished social arrangement ever had. A year after Eleanor returned from San Francisco, she stood on the same ridge where she and Rhett had been married, looking out over the valley. The clinic was thriving. The ranch was profitable. Her medical practice had expanded to include 3 other women practitioners working in surrounding communities. And Eleanor, once the invisible daughter who believed she was unlovable, had built a life that felt bigger and more real than anything Margaret could have destroyed. Rhett found her there, wrapping an arm around her waist in the casual intimacy they'd developed over months of actually building a marriage instead of just maintaining a business arrangement. "Thinking about something specific or just enjoying the view?" he asked. "Thinking about revenge?" Eleanor said. Rhett laughed. "Still planning Margaret's downfall?" "No. Realizing I already got it." Eleanor gestured at the valley below. "She sent me here to humiliate me, to prove I was worthless and unwanted and incapable of inspiring anything but pity. And instead, I built all this. A medical practice people respect, a marriage based on actual partnership, a community that values my contributions, a life that's mine because I chose it, not because it was the best available option among bad choices." "That's a pretty good revenge. It's the perfect revenge, because Margaret's stuck in Boston watching her reputation crumble while I'm out here being happy. And there's nothing she can do about it except live with the knowledge that her cruel joke created exactly the opposite of what she intended." "You think she knows that? That her plan backfired so completely?" "Oh, she knows." Vivian said Margaret reads every newspaper article about the Red Hollow Clinic with the kind of rage that suggests she understands perfectly. Eleanor smiled. "The woman who tried to break me by sending me away is now forced to watch me succeed from a distance. That's better than any dramatic confrontation could ever be." Rhett pulled her closer, and Eleanor leaned into the embrace, feeling the solid reality of a life she'd built through courage and spite, and the stubborn refusal to accept cruelty as her natural state. She thought about the frightened woman who'd boarded that train months ago, expecting rejection and humiliation. That woman had been so certain she was unworthy of love or respect or anything beyond the scraps others chose to offer. But Eleanor had learned something important in Red Hollow. Worth wasn't something you earned through perfection or usefulness. It was something you claimed by refusing to accept anyone's definition of your value except your own. Margaret had tried to teach her that she was worthless. Instead, Eleanor had learned she was worth fighting for. And that made all the difference. The sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Below, the lights of Red Hollow flickered to life one by one. Homes and businesses, and the clinic that bore Eleanor's name in simple lettering over the door. Somewhere in Boston, Margaret Blackthorne was probably sitting in a diminished social circle, bitter about the daughter who'd escaped and thrived. But here, in this moment, Eleanor didn't care what Margaret thought or felt or regretted, because the best revenge wasn't destruction or suffering or forcing Margaret to acknowledge her mistakes. The best revenge was this: standing on a ridge with the man she loved, looking at the life she'd built, and realizing that being discarded had been the greatest gift anyone could have given her. It had forced her to discover who she actually was instead of who others expected her to be. And that discovery, painful and terrifying and absolutely worth it, had set her free in ways Margaret would never understand. Eleanor Callahan, once the unwanted daughter of Boston, had become exactly what she was meant to be. Not despite the cruelty she'd endured, but because she'd refused to let that cruelty define her final chapter. And that was a story worth telling,